For my entire childhood, my family called me the ugly one. My sister was the pretty one. My brother was the smart one. I was just the disappointment lingering in the background. At our massive family reunion, my aunt walked up to me with a stranger in tow, pointing at me like I was a stain on the pristine rug. "This is the one we do not talk about." She laughed loudly. I looked at my aunt, then looked calmly at the stranger. The stranger pulled out a premium business card and looked my aunt dead in the eye. "Actually, I am here because of her," she said. "You see, I had a massive secret. Before I tell you how a single piece of paper destroyed my family's perfect illusion, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Lydia, and I am 33 years old. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of San Francisco meant absolutely everything was about appearances. My parents, Barbara and Richard, built their entire lives around looking perfect to their country club friends and extended relatives. From the outside looking in, we were the ideal American family, but inside the walls of our house, I was completely invisible. My parents had specific roles for each of their children, and if you did not fit the mold, you were cast aside. I was the one who did not fit. The annual family reunion was always the ultimate stage for my parents to show off their prized possessions, meaning my older brother and my younger sister. This year, the reunion was held at a luxury coastal estate in Monterey, California. The property was massive, featuring sweeping views of the Pacific Ocean manicured gardens and an enormous stone courtyard where dozens of my relatives were currently mingling. I stood off to the side near a large marble pillar holding a glass of sparkling water and observing the circus around me. The salty ocean breeze blew past the terrace, mixing with the smell of expensive catered seafood and expensive perfumes. I was dressed in an understated bespoke designer suit. It was a dark charcoal tailored perfectly to my frame, and it cost more than the down payment on most cars. However, my family ignored it completely, assuming it was some cheap, off-the-rack find from a discount store. They had always assumed the worst of me, and my wardrobe was no exception. I watched my parents holding court in the center of the patio. My father, Richard, had a booming voice that carried over the soft, classical music playing from the hidden outdoor speakers. He was holding a glass of expensive scotch, gesturing wildly as he bragged to my uncles. My brother Cameron was standing right beside him, soaking in the admiration. Cameron is 36 years old and holds the official title of the smart one in our family. My parents were loudly broadcasting the news that Cameron had just become a senior partner at his financial firm. Cameron stood there with his chest puffed out, wearing a flashy blue suit and an arrogant smirk. He was talking down to our younger cousins about market trends and investment portfolios, acting as though he was the foremost expert on global finance. I took a slow sip of my water. I knew the actual profit margins of his struggling firm, but I kept my mouth shut. On the other side of the courtyard was my sister Rachel. Rachel is 30 years old and has always been the pretty one. She was surrounded by a gaggle of aunts and female cousins showing off her left hand. She had recently gotten engaged to a man who came from old money, and she was making sure the sunlight caught her massive diamond ring from every possible angle. Her high-pitched laugh echoed across the stone patio every few seconds. My mother Barbara was hovering right behind Rachel, touching her hair and telling everyone how beautiful the upcoming destination wedding was going to be. I leaned back against the cool marble pillar and let out a quiet sigh. I had driven 2 hours to get here, knowing exactly how this day would play out. For 33 years, I had endured this exact same dynamic. I was the practice child, the one they pushed into the shadows so the golden children could shine brighter. I was not beautiful enough to be a trophy wife like Rachel, and I was not the loud, aggressive business shark they wanted Cameron to be. I was quiet, analytical, and observant. When I told them years ago that I was interested in data systems and coding, my father had actually laughed in my face and told me not to embarrass him by becoming a computer repair technician. Suddenly, my peripheral vision caught movement. My Aunt Pamela was marching across the patio, making a direct line toward me. Pamela was my mother's sister, and she shared the exact same toxic traits. She thrived on tearing other people down to make herself feel superior. Today, she was not alone. Walking beside her was a sharply dressed woman carrying a leather briefcase. The woman had an air of absolute authority about her, wearing a sharp tailored navy suit that commanded respect. I recognized her immediately, but I did not let it show on my face. Her name was Diana. Pamela had a wide fake smile plastered across her face as she approached me. She was clearly trying to impress Diana, who Pamela likely assumed was a wealthy guest or perhaps a representative of the estate's management given her professional attire. Pamela loved to play the role of the gracious, wealthy host, showing off her successful family members to anyone who would listen. But when she needed to provide a contrast to make Rachel and Cameron look better, she always used me. "Well, look who decided to emerge from the shadows," Pamela announced loudly, ensuring that several nearby cousins turned to watch the interaction. She gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of her hand, her heavy gold bracelets clinking together. "Diana, I was just telling you about my niece Rachel, the gorgeous bride-to-be, and my nephew Cameron, the financial genius." Pamela let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh and pointed directly at me. "And this is Lydia, the ugly duckling of the bunch." I did not blink. I just looked at Pamela, her face flushed with the thrill of putting me down. "We do not talk about her much," Pamela continued, her voice dripping with pity and condescension. "She just works with computers, fixing Wi-Fi routers or something in a dark basement. She is our little family charity case." Pamela turned to Diana, expecting the stranger to laugh along or offer a sympathetic nod. "Do not worry about her," Pamela added with a cruel smirk. "She will probably never get married anyway. She just does not have the charm or the looks for it. She is quite the disappointment to my sister, but every family has one right." The cousins nearby snickered quietly, holding their hands over their mouths. I could see my mother Barbara glancing over from across the courtyard, a look of mild annoyance on her face, as if my mere presence was ruining the aesthetic of her perfect family gathering. They all expected me to look down at my shoes. They expected me to shrink away in shame, blush with embarrassment, and quietly excuse myself to the restroom to cry. That was the role I was supposed to play. The ugly duckling who knew her place at the very bottom of the family hierarchy. But I was no longer the scared, lonely girl they had bullied for decades. I stood perfectly still, maintaining eye contact with my aunt. The silence stretched between us thick and heavy. Diana, the sharply dressed stranger, did not laugh. She did not offer a sympathetic nod to my aunt. Instead, an expression of profound disgust washed over Diana's face as she looked at Pamela. The music playing over the outdoor speakers suddenly felt very far away. The clinking of the crystal glasses around us seemed to stop entirely. Diana reached into the inner pocket of her tailored navy blazer and pulled out a premium, thick, embossed business card. She held it out not to me, but to Pamela. "Actually, I am here because of her," Diana said, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative, cutting through the ambient noise of the party. Pamela blinked, her fake smile faltering as she stared blankly at the business card. "What do you mean?" Pamela stammered. "Are you her manager at the IT help desk?" Diana took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I am the lead corporate attorney for a private holding group," Diana stated firmly. "And she is my boss." The blood completely drained from Pamela's face. Over by the catering table, my brother Cameron stopped talking mid-sentence. My mother Barbara turned fully around to stare at us. Diana did not lower her voice. In fact, she made sure it carried across the patio. "Lydia is the founder and chief executive officer of the country's most elite cybersecurity and data defense firm," Diana announced to the stunned crowd. "And as of exactly 1 hour ago, she is the majority shareholder of the investment group that just acquired this entire coastal estate." My aunt's jaw practically unhinged. She looked at me, then back at Diana, then back at me again, as if her brain could not process the information. My sister Rachel lowered her left hand, her diamond ring suddenly forgotten by the people around her. My father Richard almost dropped his glass of scotch. I remained perfectly calm. I reached out and took the heavy manila folder that Diana offered me. It contained the final deed transfer documents for the very ground my family was currently standing on. I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face as I looked at the shocked, silent faces of the people who had spent my entire life calling me a failure. The game had completely changed, and they had no idea what was about to hit them. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy pressing down on the lungs of everyone present. For 33 years, I had been the family ghost, the punchline to their cruel jokes. Now the ghost had just handed them an eviction notice disguised as a deed. Pamela was the first to break the stillness. Her face twitched, her heavy makeup suddenly looking like a fragile mask. "This is some kind of sick joke," she stammered, her voice unnaturally high. She looked over her shoulder at my mother as if asking for permission to dismiss the entire scenario. "You hired an actress, Lydia, to come here and ruin your sister's special day. It is pathetic, really." Diana did not even blink. She stepped forward and her presence commanded the space. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "There is no prank being played here, Pamela. If you look closely at the documentation my client is holding, you will see the official seal of the state and the certification from the county clerk. Aegis Data Defense, the firm Lydia built from the ground up, acquired the Monterey Coastal Holding Group 48 hours ago. The ink is dry. The wire transfers have cleared." My father Richard pushed his way through the crowd of stunned cousins. His face was a dark, mottled red. He snatched the manila folder from my hands without asking. He always believed he was entitled to anything I had. I let him take it. I wanted him to read it. I wanted him to see the numbers printed in black and white. He stared at the documents, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal jargon. He was a man who prided himself on control, and I could see the exact moment that control slipped through his fingers. His hands began to shake slightly, causing the thick parchment paper to tremble. "This cannot be right," Richard muttered, his voice losing its usual booming authority. "The holding group was not even listed on the open market. We have been trying to negotiate a stake in this property for months. How did you even get access to the cellar?" I kept my posture relaxed, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. I did not need to be aggressive. True power does not need to shout. "When you run the cybersecurity infrastructure for the private equity firm that owned the holding group," I explained calmly, "they tend to favor your acquisition bids. They wanted a fast, quiet cash sale. I provided exactly that." Cameron finally marched over, abandoning his audience of younger cousins. He grabbed the papers out of our father's hands, aggressively scanning the pages. Cameron had always built his identity on being the smartest person in the room. He was the financial prodigy, the son who was supposed to carry the family legacy into the next generation. The idea that I had outmaneuvered him in a real estate acquisition was completely breaking his brain. "This is heavily leveraged," Cameron declared, pointing a finger at me. He was trying to sound confident, but I could hear the desperation in his voice. "You probably took out a massive loan against some inflated tech startup valuation. You are drowning in debt just to show off at a family party. It is a shell game. You do not actually have the capital for this." Diana looked at my brother with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "Mr. Anderson, my client does not rely on leverage for personal acquisitions. The purchase of this $22 million estate was executed entirely in cash. Aegis Data Defense carries zero corporate debt, and Lydia retains 80% equity in the company. Your sister is not playing a shell game. She is the bank." The words $22 million in cash echoed across the stone patio. I heard my Aunt Susan drop her champagne flute. It shattered against the flagstone, but nobody moved to clean it up. The catering staff stood completely frozen, holding trays of appetizers and watching the drama unfold like a scene from a movie. My sister Rachel shoved her way to the front. Her perfect hair was blowing in the ocean breeze, and her face was contorted into an ugly expression of confusion and panic. She looked at the papers, then at Cameron, then at me. "What does that even mean?" she demanded. "What is she talking about, Cameron?" "It means I own the venue for your engagement party, Rachel," I said. "I own the gardens you wanted for your wedding photos. I own the private beach you were just bragging about to your friends. I own every square inch of this estate." Rachel gasped and instinctively clutched her diamond engagement ring, as if I was about to reach out and take that too. She looked at our mother for support. Barbara was still standing near the catering tent, her face completely drained of color. For my entire life, my mother had controlled the narrative. She dictated who was successful, who was beautiful, and who was worthy of love. She had spent decades telling the world that I was a lost cause. Seeing me standing there holding the deed to a property she could only dream of owning completely shattered her reality. "You lied to us!" Barbara finally spoke, her voice trembling with indignation. She walked slowly toward me, her eyes wide with a mix of anger and shock. "You let us believe you were working some entry-level tech job. You let us worry about your future." "I did not lie to you, Mother," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I simply stopped correcting your assumptions. You decided I was a failure when I was a teenager because I did not fit your exact mold of what a daughter should be. Whenever I tried to talk to you about my business, you changed the subject to Rachel's dating life or Cameron's promotions. You never asked what my company did. You never asked if I was happy. You just assumed I was struggling because it fit the story you wanted to tell." Pamela tried to regain her footing, crossing her arms and lifting her chin. "Well, if you are so wealthy now, why are you dressed like that? You could have at least made an effort for a family event instead of showing up in that drab suit." Diana actually chuckled, a dry, sharp sound. "That drab suit, Pamela, is a custom piece tailored specifically for Lydia in Milan. It costs more than your entire jewelry collection. Just because she does not feel the need to cover herself in flashy labels to prove her worth does not mean she lacks taste. It simply means she has nothing to prove to people who judge books by their covers." Pamela's mouth snapped shut. She looked down at her own heavy gold bracelets, suddenly looking very self-conscious. The power dynamic in the courtyard had completely inverted. The family members who had spent the last hour ignoring me or whispering cruel jokes behind my back were now staring at me with a mixture of fear and profound respect. The cousins who had laughed at Pamela's ugly duckling comment were now looking down at their shoes, unable to meet my gaze. My father tried to salvage his pride. He stood up straighter, adjusting his expensive tie. "Well then," he said, forcing a booming laugh that sounded incredibly hollow. "It seems we have a lot to celebrate today. Not only do we have Cameron's partnership and Rachel's engagement, but our little Lydia has apparently been holding out on us. We should open a special bottle of champagne. The Anderson family has truly conquered the world." He stepped forward, holding his arms out as if to embrace me. He wanted to claim my victory as his own. He wanted to fold my empire into the Anderson family legacy. He wanted everyone watching to believe that my success was a direct result of his parenting. I took a deliberate step backward, avoiding his embrace. My father's arms fell awkwardly to his sides. The forced smile on his face cracked. "We are not celebrating my success today, Dad," I said, "because my success has nothing to do with this family. I did not build my company with Anderson money, and I certainly did not build it with Anderson's support. I built it in spite of you. I built it while you were busy telling your country club friends that I was your practice child." Richard flinched. He had always assumed I did not hear the cruel things he said behind my back. He assumed I was deaf and blind to the constant slights and insults that filled my childhood. "Lydia." "Please," Richard murmured, his voice dropping to a low warning register. "Do not do this here. Not in front of everyone. Keep family business private." "You did not care about privacy when Aunt Pamela was humiliating me 5 minutes ago," I pointed out. "You did not care about privacy when you loudly bragged about Cameron and Rachel while ignoring my existence. You only care about privacy now because you are the ones feeling embarrassed." Diana stepped up beside me, closing her briefcase with a solid, satisfying snap. "The legal documents have been transferred, and the property management team will be contacting you regarding the new ownership protocols. Lydia, we have the board meeting call in 20 minutes. We should proceed to the private suite." I nodded to Diana, then looked back at my family. The crowd of relatives was completely silent, hanging on my every word. "Enjoy the reunion," I said, projecting my voice so every single person on the patio could hear me clearly. "Please eat, drink, and take as many photos as you like. The catering has already been fully paid for by my company as a courtesy. Treat this estate as if it were your own, because as of today, it is mine." I turned my back on them, and walked toward the massive glass doors of the main house. I did not look back to see my father's rage or my sister's tears. The sea of relatives parted for me, instantly stepping out of my way. But I knew the peace would not last. My mother was not the type to surrender her control without a vicious fight. Before I could even reach the threshold of the private suite, I could hear the sharp, frantic clicking of her designer heels marching rapidly across the stone patio right behind me. "Lydia, wait." My mother's voice cracked like a whip through the open glass doors. I paused just inside the grand foyer of the main house. Diana gave me a brief, knowing look and discreetly stepped further down the hall to give us a semblance of privacy. I turned slowly as Barbara marched inside her face, a mask of barely contained fury. She grabbed my upper arm, her manicured fingernails digging into my jacket sleeve, and yanked me into a private alcove off the main hallway. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. "You come here after barely speaking to us for a year and pull a stunt like this. Buying the estate out from under your brother's firm, trying to upstage your sister's engagement party with this ridiculous display of wealth. It is petty, Lydia. It is incredibly petty and vindictive." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, then back up to her face. "I am not trying to upstage anyone, Mother. I simply bought a piece of real estate that my company found valuable. You are the ones who made it a spectacle." Barbara dropped my arm but stepped closer, invading my personal space. She was trying to reassert the physical dominance she had held over me when I was a child. "Do not play innocent with me," she snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You know Cameron has been trying to secure this property for his clients. He has been working on this deal for 6 months. This was supposed to be his big victory lap today, and you ruined it just to show off." I laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed in the small alcove. "Cameron has been fumbling this deal for 6 months because his firm lacks the liquid capital to make a competitive offer. The sellers were tired of waiting for him to secure financing. They wanted a buyer who could close the deal immediately without leveraging external assets. My company had the funds. We made the offer. That is business, Mother. It has nothing to do with upstaging Cameron." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "You always had a jealous streak. Even when you were little, you could not stand it when Cameron or Rachel got attention. You always had to act out to try and steal the spotlight. And now you are using this new money of yours to punish them for being successful. It is a terrible look, Lydia. It makes you seem incredibly insecure." The audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite the last 20 minutes, let alone the last 33 years, right to my face. "Insecure." I repeated, my voice steady, but dropping an octave. "You want to talk about insecure? Let us talk about the summer before I started college. Let us talk about how I earned early admission to MIT. But you and Dad absolutely refused to co-sign my student loans. You told me it was a waste of money because I would probably just drop out or fail the rigorous math courses. You said it was too risky an investment for a degree I would never use." Barbara waved her hand dismissively. "We were trying to be realistic. We did not want you burdened with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt if you changed your mind. We were protecting you." "Protecting me," I countered, stepping forward and forcing her to take a half step back. "2 days later, you bought Rachel a brand new Mercedes convertible for her high school graduation. You paid for it in cash. You told everyone at the dealership it was a reward for her hard work. She barely maintained a C-average mother. I was valedictorian. You did not refuse my loans to protect me. You refused them because you did not want to invest in the ugly duckling. You did not believe I was capable of achieving anything." "That is ancient history," Barbara deflected, looking away toward the hallway. "You are bringing up ancient history to justify your terrible behavior today." "It is not ancient history," I said, my voice rising slightly. "It is the foundation of exactly who I am today. You forced me to figure it out on my own." I worked 3 jobs in Boston while carrying a full course load. I slept on a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment that did not have heat in the winter. I built my first software program on a laptop I bought from a pawn shop. I did not have a safety net. I did not have a family to fall back on. Barbara crossed her arms, adopting a defensive posture. "And look how well you turned out. You should be thanking us. We taught you independence. We gave you the drive to succeed. If we had coddled you like you wanted, you never would have built this company of yours." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by her ability to twist her own neglect into a parenting victory. "You do not get to take credit for my survival," I told her coldly. "You threw me into the deep end, hoping I would drown, so you would not have to deal with the disappointment of raising me. You did not teach me independence. You taught me that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally will abandon you the second you fail to meet their superficial expectations." She flinched, but her pride would not let her concede. "You are being overly dramatic, Lydia. We always loved you. We just had different ways of showing it. Different ways I asked, like when Dad told his friends at the country club that I was your practice child." Barbara froze. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I was 16. I continued the memory, as sharp and painful as the day it happened. I was waiting by the tennis courts to get a ride home. Dad was having drinks with the club president and a few other men. One of them asked why I was so quiet and awkward compared to Cameron and Rachel. Dad laughed. He actually laughed and told them I was just the practice run, the rough draft before you guys figured out how to make perfect children. "I did not know you heard that," Barbara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I heard it," I confirmed. "I heard it, and I internalized it. I spent years trying to figure out how to fix myself so I wouldn't be the practice child anymore. I spent years trying to earn a fraction of the praise you showered on Cameron for simply existing. But the joke is on you, Mother. The practice child just bought the ground you are standing on." Barbara recovered quickly, her survival instincts kicking in. She straightened her posture and smoothed the front of her expensive dress. "Fine," she said, her tone shifting from defensive to businesslike. "You are angry. You have made your point. You are successful and you want us to acknowledge it. Consider it acknowledged. Now let us talk about the estate." She took a step closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially, as if we were suddenly allies. "You cannot manage a property like this from a tech office, Lydia. You do not know real estate. You do not know property management or hospitality. Cameron's firm specializes in high-end asset management. He has the contacts to maximize the value of this land. You need to let him handle the real estate portfolio. You can keep the title, but let him manage the day-to-day operations. We can frame it as a joint family venture." I stared at her, almost admiring her relentless ambition. Even now, confronted with her own cruelty and my undeniable success, her only goal was to find a way to extract value from me and hand it to Cameron. She could not accept a reality where I held power over her golden boy. "You want me to hand over the management of a $22 million asset to the brother who just spent 20 minutes trying to convince everyone I was drowning in debt?" I asked. "You want me to let Cameron take a management fee off the top of my investment so he can pretend he is the one pulling the strings?" "It makes sense," Barbara insisted. "It keeps the money in the family. It helps Cameron's firm show strong assets under management, which he needs right now. And it saves you from embarrassing yourself by trying to run a property you know nothing about. We can draw up the contracts tomorrow. It is the best solution for everyone." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "You still do not get it, do you? There is no joint family venture. There is no we. There is only me and the company I built. Cameron is not touching this property. He is not getting a management fee. He is not getting a consulting fee. He is not getting a dime of my money to prop up his failing reputation." Barbara's eyes narrowed, her patience finally exhausted. "You are making a huge mistake, Lydia. You think you are so smart because you made some money in tech, but you do not understand how things work at this level. You do not understand family legacy. You need us whether you want to admit it or not. You cannot navigate this world alone." "I am not alone," I replied, turning toward the hallway where Diana was waiting patiently. "I have a team of professionals who actually respect me. I have a board of directors who value my input. I have built an empire without your help, and I will continue to run it without your interference." I stepped out of the alcove, leaving Barbara standing in the shadows. "We are done here, Mother. Go back to your party. Enjoy the champagne. And please tell Cameron that if he ever tries to speak to me about my financial leverage again, I will buy his firm and fire him myself." I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking decisively on the polished marble floor. Behind me, I heard Barbara let out a frustrated sound, a sharp intake of breath that signaled her loss of control. I did not look back. I had delivered the message and I knew she had heard it, but I also knew the war was far from over. My family did not surrender easily, and Cameron would not take this humiliation lying down. I walked back out into the sunlit courtyard where the ocean breeze offered a brief reprieve from the suffocating air of the main house. Diana stood near the grand sweeping staircase checking her phone, but her eyes darted up the moment I appeared. She gave a slight nod, indicating the private suite was secured and ready for my board meeting. I intended to walk straight past the catering tables and head upstairs, leaving the family to stew in their own shock. I did not get the chance. Cameron deliberately stepped right into my path. He had a fresh glass of expensive scotch in one hand, and his other hand was tucked casually into the pocket of his flashy blue suit. He had purposefully positioned himself in the exact center of the terrace, surrounded by Uncle Thomas, Aunt Linda, and several older cousins who always hung on his every word. He wanted a public spectacle. He wanted to restore the natural order of the universe, where he was the unassailable genius and I was the helpless punchline. "Well, look who decided to rejoin the adults," Cameron announced, his voice projecting loudly enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. He smiled, but it was a predatory, tight expression. "Mom just told me you are throwing a little tantrum in the hallway about management rights. Let us clear the air right now, Lydia." I stopped walking and looked at him. I did not cross my arms or shift my weight. I just stood perfectly still and let him dig his own grave. "It is cute that your little tech startup managed to scrape together a bid for this place," Cameron continued, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. "But we all know how this game is played. You secured a mezzanine loan against an inflated tech valuation. You leveraged yourself to the hilt, and you are praying the market does not correct itself before you can figure out what to do with a massive commercial asset. You think buying a premium property is like writing a line of code. It is not." He took a step closer, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. The older cousins watched with rapt attention, waiting for me to wither under his brilliant financial analysis. "Your debt-to-equity ratio must be astronomical right now," Cameron sneered, his tone dripping with fake brotherly concern. "You are drowning in high-interest debt just to show off at a family party. It is a classic liquidity trap. You do not actually have the operating capital to maintain an estate of this magnitude. The property taxes alone will bankrupt your firm in 2 quarters. I am trying to save you from yourself, Lydia. Transfer the management rights to my firm. We will restructure your debt, stabilize your assets, and prevent you from defaulting. You can keep your name on the deed to feel important, but let the actual professionals handle the money before you lose everything." He finished his speech with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He looked at our father Richard, who was standing a few feet away, nodding in solemn agreement. Cameron honestly believed he had just intellectually dismantled me in front of the entire extended family. He believed he had exposed me as a naive amateur playing a dangerous game with fake money. I looked at my brother. I looked at the smug grin on his face and the expensive watch on his wrist. For my entire life, he had used big words and loud declarations to make me feel small. He was the golden boy who could do no wrong, the financial prodigy who was destined to conquer Wall Street. "Are you quite finished, Cameron?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it carried a deadly calm that instantly wiped the smirk off his face. He scoffed, swirling the ice in his glass. "I am just giving you a reality check. Let us talk about reality," I said, taking a deliberate step toward him. "Let us talk about hard data. You seem to think my company writes simple lines of code. We do not. Aegis Data Defense secures the global financial infrastructure for institutional investors. We audit banking networks. We protect trading algorithms. We see the raw data. We see the real ledgers. I see everything, Cameron." I did not raise my voice, but the temperature on the patio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cameron blinked, his posture stiffening slightly. "You want to talk about leverage?" I continued, my gaze locking onto his eyes. "Let us look at Vanguard Holdings, your firm. Dad was bragging earlier about how you were just made senior partner. The whole family clapped for you. But Vanguard did not promote you because of your brilliant market strategies, did they? Cameron opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The ice in his glass stopped swirling. They promoted you because they desperately needed a capital injection, I stated cleanly and clinically. Your firm is currently trying to cover a 34% drop in quarterly revenue following that disastrous commercial real estate default in Chicago last month, a default that you personally managed. Cameron went completely rigid. The blood vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. Uncle Thomas frowned, looking back and forth between us. That is confidential firm information, Cameron stammered, his voice suddenly sounding thin and reedy. You cannot possibly know that. I know that your client retention rate has plummeted 19% since January. I continued relentlessly dropping the numbers like heavy stones on the stone patio. I know that 2 of your anchor funds are currently operating at a net loss. I know that your personal portfolio is highly leveraged in commercial retail space, which is currently tanking nationwide. You are hemorrhaging liquidity, Cameron. You are drowning. I took another step forward, invading his space the exact way he had always invaded mine. You do not want to manage this estate to save me, I said, my voice sharp and clear. You desperately need to secure the management fees from this property to cover your own margin calls. You need this asset to show your board that you are still bringing in revenue. You are exactly 3 bad weeks away from a catastrophic liquidity crunch, and you saw my acquisition as your personal life raft. The silence on the terrace was absolute. The entire family was staring at Cameron, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to produce a brilliant counter-argument. They waited for the golden boy to put the ugly duckling back in her place. Cameron stood there, his mouth opening and closing. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He looked wildly at our father, but Richard was staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. Richard knew enough about finance to recognize the hyper-specific details I had just dropped. He knew I was not making it up. That is a lie, Cameron managed to choke out, but his voice cracked on the final word. It sounded pathetic. It sounded like a little boy getting caught stealing from the cookie jar. I do not lie, Cameron, I said coldly. And my data does not lie. Do not ever use buzzwords you learned in a freshman finance seminar to try and intimidate me again. My company bought this estate with liquid cash. 0 debt. 0 leverage. I have a 9-figure operating budget that does not rely on inflated real estate portfolios or predatory loans. I do not need a bridge loan to survive. And I certainly do not need a failing wealth manager trying to siphon off my assets to save his own sinking ship. Cameron physically stepped back from me. His shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the ground, entirely defeated. The brilliant, arrogant older brother had been completely dismantled in less than 3 minutes. I had stripped away his entire identity in front of the people he cared about impressing the most. Lydia. That is enough. Richard finally stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. He was trying to sound authoritative, but he looked terrified. You have made your point. There is no need to humiliate your brother in front of the family. He started this conversation, Dad, I pointed out, maintaining my clinical composure. He attempted to humiliate me publicly to assert his dominance. I simply finished the conversation with accurate data. If the truth humiliates him, that is his failure, not mine. I turned away from my father and my brother, brushing an invisible speck of dust off the sleeve of my bespoke suit. The crowd of relatives remained frozen in place, watching me with a newfound sense of awe and profound fear. I had not just defeated the golden boy, I had utterly destroyed the illusion of his success. Diana was waiting for me at the base of the staircase, a faint smile playing on her lips. Shall we proceed to the boardroom, Ms. Anderson? Diana asked, her professional tone ringing out clearly in the quiet courtyard. The executive team is waiting on the secure line. Yes, Diana, let us go, I replied. I have wasted enough time here. I walked past my stunned family, leaving Cameron staring blankly at his shoes, and my father looking like his entire world had just collapsed. I climbed the grand sweeping staircase of my newly acquired estate, feeling lighter than I had in 33 years. The financial intimidation tactic had failed spectacularly. The family hierarchy was officially dead, and I was the one holding the shovel. 2 hours later, I concluded my board meeting in the estate's master suite. Diana packed her laptop into her leather briefcase and offered me a rare look of genuine approval. She informed me that the caterers had finished setting up the formal dinner on the oceanfront terrace, and that my family's entire demeanor had undergone a miraculous transformation while I was upstairs. I thanked her and headed down the grand sweeping staircase alone. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at the bottom. Predators do not simply surrender when they are disarmed. They just change their camouflage and wait for a better angle to strike. As I stepped onto the expansive stone terrace, the atmosphere was jarringly different. The hushed, panicked whispers from earlier had completely vanished. My mother Barbara practically sprinted across the travertine tiles to greet me. Her previously mask-like face, furious and pale just hours ago, was now stretched into a wide, beaming smile of sheer maternal devotion. "Lydia, darling," she sang out, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. She reached out and grasped both of my hands, squeezing them tightly. "We have been waiting for you to start dinner. You simply must come see what I have done with the seating arrangements." Before I could pull my hands away, she linked her arm firmly through mine and paraded me through the crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins. The extended relatives parted like the Red Sea, offering me tight, nervous smiles. Barbara led me directly to the massive mahogany dining table, which was set with fine bone china and crystal under an elegant canopy of string lights. She brought me straight to the head of the table, the seat of honor, the seat that my father Richard had occupied at every single family holiday, Thanksgiving dinner, and summer reunion since the day I was born. "Sit right here, sweetheart," Barbara insisted, pulling out the heavy carved chair with a theatrical flourish. "The guest of honor deserves the absolute best view of the ocean." I looked down at the ornate place cards. She had literally taken a pen, crossed out Richard's name, and written mine in sweeping cursive lettering. My father was now seated to my immediate right, looking incredibly stiff but forcing a strained, welcoming smile. Cameron was seated further down the table, staring intensely at his empty porcelain plate. He looked like a man walking to the gallows, but he remained quiet. I took my seat slowly, resting my hands flat on the linen tablecloth. The sudden shift in their strategy was so entirely predictable it was almost insulting. They realized that outright intimidation and gaslighting had failed spectacularly. Now they were attempting to sedate me with fake affection, hoping I was still that desperate, lonely little girl who would trade her entire soul and bank account for a single scrap of maternal warmth. I barely had time to unfold my napkin before my sister Rachel swooped in. She pulled up a chair incredibly close to my left side. The massive diamond engagement ring she had been relentlessly flashing all afternoon was now conspicuously turned inward, catching far less light. Her eyes were already brimming with heavy manufactured tears. She reached out and placed her perfectly manicured hand directly over mine. "Lydia," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with heavy, theatrical emotion, "I am so incredibly glad we are finally sitting next to each other. It feels like it has been forever." I looked at her hand resting on my tailored sleeve, then looked up into her tear-filled eyes. "We sat at the exact same table during Thanksgiving 3 years ago, Rachel," I replied evenly. "You spent the entire meal talking to Cameron about your luxury trip to Paris, and you told me my sweater looked like a discount retail uniform." Rachel let out a breathless, shaky laugh as a single perfect tear rolled down her cheek. "I was so immature back then," she cried softly. "You have to forgive me. I have just missed my big sister so much." She leaned closer, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating, heavily perfumed hug. "When I saw you standing up to Cameron today, I realized how much I truly look up to you. You are so strong, Lydia. I want us to be incredibly close again. I want you to be a huge part of my life and a huge part of my wedding. We need to be a real family again." I did not return the hug. I sat perfectly rigid until she finally pulled back, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a white linen napkin to protect her makeup. It was a masterful performance. If I did not know with absolute certainty that she had spent the last decade mocking my career And telling all her high society friends I was a lost cause, I might have actually believed her. But I saw the sharp, calculating gleam hiding right behind her wet eyelashes. She was laying the groundwork. They all were. The catering staff stepped forward and began serving the first course. The dinner conversation was entirely focused on me. Aunts and uncles who had actively ignored my existence for years were suddenly intensely fascinated by my cybersecurity firm. Uncle Thomas asked for my expert opinion on emerging tech stocks. Aunt Pamela, the exact same woman who had loudly called me an ugly duckling just hours earlier, kept offering to refill my wineglass and praising the tailoring of my suit. It was a suffocating barrage of relentless flattery. Barbara constantly interrupted anyone who spoke, ensuring the spotlight remained fixed firmly and blindingly on me. She acted as if my massive success was the direct result of her brilliant, nurturing parenting. Lydia always had such a highly focused mind, Barbara announced to the entire table, waving her silver fork in the air. While other girls her age were distracted by silly, trivial things, Lydia was building her future. Richard and I always knew she was destined for greatness. We gave her the space to thrive independently, and look how beautifully it paid off. I ate my salad in total silence, letting them spin their elaborate web of lies. I knew a trap was being set. I could see Richard exchanging loaded, significant glances with Cameron and Barbara across the table. They were treating me exactly like a wealthy angel investor they were trying to soften up before delivering a massive corporate pitch. As the main course was cleared away and the expensive champagne was poured into fresh glasses, Richard stood up. He picked up his crystal flute and tapped it lightly with a silver spoon. The ringing sound instantly silenced the entire terrace. Every relative turned their full attention to the patriarch of the Anderson family. Richard smiled, looking down at me from his standing position. His eyes were completely cold and calculating, but his voice projected the warm, jovial, booming tone of a deeply proud father. "If I may have everyone's attention." Richard began, holding his glass high in the air. "Today has been a day of tremendous surprises and wonderful revelations. For years, this family has proudly celebrated the many milestones of Cameron and Rachel. But today, we celebrate the prodigal daughter. Today, we celebrate Lydia." Polite, enthusiastic applause rippled around the long dining table. I did not move a single muscle. "Lydia has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that she possesses the true Anderson spirit." Richard continued, his voice rising with theatrical pride. "She has finally found her footing in the corporate world. She is a late bloomer, but she has achieved a level of financial success that frankly none of us anticipated. And with great success comes great responsibility. The absolute foundation of the Anderson legacy has always been unity. We protect our own. We elevate our own. Blood is thicker than water." He took a dramatic, calculated pause, looking around the table to ensure everyone was hanging on his every word. He was leveraging the entire extended family, applying maximum public social pressure to corner me. "That is why I am so incredibly proud to announce that Lydia has graciously agreed to step up and fulfill her family duty," Richard proclaimed, his voice booming across the coastal terrace. "As her very first act as the new owner of this magnificent estate, Lydia will be making a primary investment to stabilize Cameron's financial firm, ensuring that his partnership remains secure and our family's market reputation remains completely untarnished." Cameron looked up, offering a tight, forced smile to the clapping and cheering relatives. He looked like he wanted to vomit from the humiliation of needing a bailout, but he played along flawlessly with the charade. "But that is not all," Richard declared, his smile growing wider, showing all his teeth as he looked directly at me. "Lydia has also insisted on giving her younger sister the ultimate wedding gift. To celebrate Rachel's upcoming marriage, Lydia will be entirely funding Rachel's destination wedding in Lake Como, Italy. A $150,000 contribution to ensure her little sister has the magical day she truly deserves." Rachel let out a loud theatrical gasp, covering her mouth with both of her hands. She looked at me with wide, shining eyes, acting completely shocked by the announcement she had clearly helped script in the hallway. "Lydia, you should not have," Rachel cried out, her voice carrying perfectly over the ocean breeze. "It is entirely too much. I cannot accept." "Nonsense," Barbara chimed in immediately, reaching over to pat my hand with aggressive affection. Your sister wants to do this for you, Rachel. It is her way of making up for lost time. It is her way of finally being a real, true part of this family now that she can contribute. Richard raised his champagne glass even higher. To Lydia. For finally stepping up and doing what is right for the family. To Lydia, the extended family echoed, raising their glasses in perfect unison. They all drank. They were looking at me with expectant, bright smiles, waiting for me to bow my head, accept my designated role as their newly minted bank account, and quietly write the checks. They had cornered me in front of 50 relatives. They believed that the fear of public embarrassment, the fear of ruining a beautiful family toast, would force me into total compliance. They thought the heavy social pressure was a cage I could not possibly escape. They were absolutely wrong. I did not touch my champagne flute. I let the echoes of their cheerful toast fade into the ocean breeze. 50 expectant faces watched me, waiting for my tearful speech of gratitude and submission. They thought they had boxed me into a corner where social etiquette would force my compliance. I remained seated for a long, deliberate moment, looking directly at my father. Then I pushed my chair back with a loud scrape against the travertine tile and stood up. "Thank you for that incredibly imaginative fiction, Dad," I said. My voice was not loud, but the utter lack of emotion in it cut through the festive atmosphere like a scalpel. But let me offer a slight correction to the official record. I will not be investing a single dollar into Cameron's failing firm, and I will certainly not be financing a $150,000 Italian vacation for Rachel. The silence that hit the terrace was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs below. I scanned the faces of my extended family, making sure my voice carried to the furthest tables. Since we are sharing announcements tonight, let me be perfectly clear. My company acquired this estate because it is a prime commercial asset. That is where my financial involvement with this family begins and exactly where it ends. I am not a bank. I am not a bailout fund. And I am definitely not paying a belated entry fee to be accepted by people who spent my entire life pretending I did not exist. The collective gasp from the aunts and uncles rippled down the table. Rachel dropped her facade first. Her lower lip stopped quivering with fake tears and curled into an ugly sneer. "You cannot do this!" Rachel shrieked, slamming her hand down on the table so hard her silverware rattled. "Dad just told everyone you were paying for the wedding. You cannot just back out and humiliate us in front of the whole family." "I cannot back out of an agreement I never made." "Rachel," I replied smoothly, "you and Dad fabricated a script in the hallway and tried to force me to read my lines on stage." "The show is canceled." Barbara shot up from her chair, her face turning a deep, mottled crimson. Her gracious hostess persona evaporated instantly, replaced by the vicious bully I had known my entire life. "How dare you!" Barbara screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "How dare you sit at my table and disrespect this family? We gave you everything. We welcomed you back with open arms, and this is how you repay us. By humiliating your brother and ruining your sister's wedding. You are exactly the same selfish, ungrateful brat you have always been." I did not flinch. The venom in her voice was familiar, comfortable even. It was the truth. The fake love bombing had felt disgusting, but this raw, unhinged hatred was genuine. "You did not welcome me back." "Mother," I corrected her. "You welcomed my bank account. You thought you could flatter me into submission. But I am not the insecure teenager desperate for your approval anymore. I see exactly what you are doing." Richard stepped toward me. His chest puffed out, his fists clenched at his sides. "You listen to me, you arrogant little girl," he barked, spittle flying from his lips. "You think because you made some money in the tech world you can disrespect the Anderson name. We built you. We gave you the drive to succeed. If you do not write those checks right now, you are no longer a part of this family. We will cut you off completely." I laughed. It was a genuine, amused laugh. "You cut me off 15 years ago, Dad. You told your country club friends I was a practice run. You refused to co-sign my student loans. You cannot threaten to take away something you never gave me in the first place." Cameron, who had been sitting in sullen silence, finally stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, trying to project an air of superiority, but his face was slick with sweat. He pointed an accusatory finger across the table. You know what your problem is, Lydia? Cameron sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You are bitter. You have always been bitter because you are the ugly one. You have all this money, but you have absolutely no life. You do not have a husband. You do not have a family. You sit alone in some sterile penthouse hoarding cash because nobody actually wants you. You are a lonely, sad spinster taking out her pathetic jealousy on her younger sister because Rachel is actually beautiful and loved. Rachel eagerly jumped onto the bandwagon, emboldened by Cameron's attack. She is just jealous, Rachel agreed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. She knows she will never get a ring like this. She knows no man from a respectable family would ever look twice at her. She is trying to ruin my wedding because she knows she will never have one of her own. You are pathetic, Lydia. You think money makes you powerful, but you are still just the ugly duckling we all pitied. The insults rained down exactly as they had when I was a child. They attacked my appearance, my relationship status, my desirability. They reverted to the most basic, shallow metrics of worth because that was the only currency they understood. To them, a woman's value was entirely dependent on her ability to secure a wealthy husband and maintain a pristine social image. They truly believed that reminding me of my physical shortcomings would break my spirit and force me to submit. The extended relatives at the table shifted uncomfortably. A few of the older aunts averted their eyes, clearly embarrassed by the sheer vitriol coming from my parents and siblings. But no one spoke up to defend me. They never did. The golden rule of the Anderson family was to never cross Richard and Barbara. I let them rant. I stood there with my hands clasped loosely in front of me, maintaining perfect eye contact with each of them as they hurled their venom. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not show a single ounce of vulnerability. I just watched them exhaust their limited vocabulary of insults. I let the entire extended family witness the hideous reality of the golden children and the perfect parents. When Cameron finally ran out of breath and Rachel stopped shouting about her ruined destination wedding, the terrace grew quiet again. They stared at me, breathing heavily, expecting me to break. They expected me to run away in tears just like I used to do when I was 16. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. Are you quite finished? I asked. My voice was calm, cold, and completely unbothered. Barbara crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing with absolute hatred. You are a sociopath, she hissed. You have no emotions. You do not care about anyone but yourself. I care very much about the truth, Mother, I replied. And I care about bad investments. Cameron just accused me of hoarding money. He claimed I was a lonely spinster taking out my jealousy on the family. But I am not hoarding money. I am simply refusing to throw it into a black hole. I pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from my jacket. It was sealed with red tamper-evident tape. I held it up for a moment, letting the dim overhead string lights catch the bright red seal. You see, Dad? I continued, turning my gaze back to Richard. You demanded that I bail out Cameron's financial firm. You stood up in front of 50 relatives and declared it was my family duty to protect the Anderson legacy and save his partnership. You made it sound like a simple liquidity issue, a temporary market fluctuation that a good sister should cover to help her brother. Richard lifted his chin, his jaw tight. It is a temporary cash flow problem, he insisted stubbornly. Vanguard Holdings is a premier firm. Your brother is a brilliant manager. He just needs a bridge to the next quarter. I nodded slowly, walking toward the center of the large dining table. A bridge to the next quarter. That is a very creative way to describe it. I stopped right in front of Richard and Barbara. Cameron was standing just a few feet away, looking suddenly very pale. I placed the thick manila envelope flat on the center of the linen tablecloth. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood underneath echoed in the tense silence. I am not bailing Cameron out. Dad, I said, my voice carrying clearly to every single person seated on the terrace. And you are all about to see exactly why. I broke the red tamper-evident tape with my thumb. The sharp tearing sound was shockingly loud in the silent ocean air. Every eye at the long dining table was locked onto my hands. Cameron took a sudden jerky step forward, his hands outstretched as if he was going to snatch the envelope away, but Diana smoothly stepped between us. Her presence alone was enough to make him freeze in his tracks. I slid a thick stack of printed spreadsheets out of the envelope and let them fan out across the white linen. They were covered in highlighted rows, red ink, and bolded corporate routing numbers. I told you earlier that Aegis Data Defense secures global financial infrastructure. I began keeping my tone conversational but commanding. What I did not mention is that our primary specialty is forensic data auditing. We do not just build firewalls. We hunt down financial anomalies for federal regulators and institutional investors. When my firm moved to acquire the holding group that currently holds your corporate debt, my lead engineers ran a routine mandatory deep dive into the associated asset portfolios. We pulled the digital floorboards up. We traced every single wire transfer, every offshore routing number, and every hidden limited liability company tied to Vanguard Holdings. My father, Richard, frowned deeply, his heavy brow furrowing as he tried to keep up. "An audit," he said, his voice tight. "You ran an unauthorized audit on your brother's firm. That is corporate espionage, Lydia. I will have you arrested before the night is over." I did not even look at him. Diana handled that. Actually, Richard, Diana stated, her voice ringing with absolute legal authority. The audit was standard corporate due diligence legally mandated prior to the acquisition of distressed debt. Everything in those files was obtained through entirely legal corporate transparency clauses, which Cameron himself signed when he used his firm's assets as collateral for a bridging loan last year. Cameron looked like he was going to pass out. He grabbed the back of an empty dining chair, his knuckles turning completely white. He opened his mouth, but his chest was heaving so heavily he could not form a single word. I picked up the first stack of papers and held them up. "You see, Dad, Cameron does not have a temporary liquidity issue. A liquidity issue implies that money is tied up in slow-moving assets like commercial real estate or long-term bonds. But Vanguard Holdings does not have slow-moving assets. Vanguard Holdings has zero assets because Cameron has been actively, systematically embezzling millions of dollars from his own clients' trust accounts for the past 4 years." The word embezzling dropped onto the table like a live grenade. Aunt Pamela gasped loudly, pressing a hand to her pearl necklace. Uncle Thomas, the pediatrician who had been so friendly to me earlier, pushed his chair back from the table, his face masked in pure horror. "That is a lie!" Cameron screamed, his voice cracking. He lunged toward the table, but my father threw an arm out to stop him, his own face stricken with sudden, terrifying doubt. "You altered those documents, Lydia. You faked the data to frame me because you are a jealous, vindictive psycho." I dropped the papers back onto the table and tapped a highlighted row with my index finger. $2.4 million, I read aloud, clearly and precisely. Wired on October 12th of last year, from a Vanguard client escrow account to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. A shell corporation that just happens to process payments for a massive, illegal offshore sports betting syndicate. I picked up another sheet. $800,000 wired on February 3rd directly to a private high-stakes poker room in Macau. Another $1.2 million in April to a crypto exchange known for laundering gambling debts. I can keep going, Cameron. I have 40 pages of this. I looked directly into my brother's terrified eyes. "You are not a financial prodigy, Cameron. You are a crippling gambling addict who used his clients' retirement funds as your own personal casino chip. You lost millions of dollars that did not belong to you, and when the margin calls came due, you stole even more to try and cover your tracks. You are not facing a bad quarter. You are facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud." The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Nobody breathed. The sound of the waves crashing below the terrace felt deafening. Richard turned slowly to look at his golden boy. His face was gray. The arrogant patriarch who had just toasted his son's brilliance was now staring at a stranger. "Cameron," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "Cameron, tell me she is making this up. Tell me right now that this is a lie." Cameron could not look at him. The smart one, the brother who had spent his entire life making me feel stupid, stared at the travertine patio tiles with tears streaming down his face. He was shaking violently, his perfect tailored suit suddenly looking like a costume he had stolen. But I was not done. The operation was not complete. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the second stack of papers. These were highlighted in bright yellow. I turned my attention to my sister. Rachel was clutching her fiancé's arm, her eyes wide with shock, watching her brother implode. She thought she was safe. She thought she was just a spectator to Cameron's destruction. She was absolutely wrong. "Now, Rachel," I said, my voice shifting to a sharp, deadly cadence. "You had a lot to say earlier about my pathetic life. You called me a lonely spinster. You bragged about your beautiful destination wedding, your designer clothes, and the fact that you are the pretty one who deserves to be pampered." Rachel swallowed hard, shrinking back slightly against her fiancé. "Leave me out of this," she stammered. "I do not know anything about Cameron's business. I am not involved in this." "You are more involved than anyone," I corrected her smoothly, because losing money at the poker table was only half of Cameron's problem. The other half was you. I slid the yellow highlighted papers across the white linen, stopping right in front of her place setting. Rachel stared down at the documents, refusing to touch them. "Let us talk about your perfect lifestyle," I continued. "The lifestyle that proves how much better you are than me." 3 years ago, Dad's company hit a massive cash flow crisis. We all know this. What you do not know is that Mom and Dad completely ran out of liquid cash to fund your vanity projects. They could not pay for your $50,000 wardrobe refreshes, your first-class flights to Dubai, or the lease on your luxury condo in Manhattan. Barbara let out a sharp, choking sound. She tried to step forward to stop me, but Diana shot her a warning glare that pinned her to the spot. "But you could not handle looking poor Rachel," I said, raising my voice to ensure the entire extended family heard every single word. "You could not handle the idea that your high society friends might realize the Anderson family was struggling. So you went to Cameron whining and crying about needing to maintain appearances. And Cameron, playing the role of the protective, successful older brother, decided to help you out." I tapped the yellow highlighted papers. "Over the last 36 months, Cameron has funneled roughly $1.8 million of embezzled client funds directly into your personal accounts. He categorized them as consulting fees for marketing services you never provided." Rachel's fiancé, a man named Preston who came from old conservative money, physically dropped her arm and took a large step away from her. He looked at the documents on the table and then looked at Rachel with utter revulsion. "You paid for this entire engagement party using stolen retirement funds, Rachel," I stated cleanly. "Your custom designer gown, the catering we are eating right now, the deposits for your Lake Como wedding. Every single luxury you have flaunted in my face today was bought with dirty, stolen money. You are not a high society princess, Rachel. You are a glorified accessory to federal wire fraud." "That is not true!" Rachel shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical wail. She grabbed the papers, frantically flipping through them. "I did not know where the money came from. Cameron told me it was from his personal trust. He told me it was his bonus money. I did not know it was stolen. Preston, please, you have to believe me." She turned to grab her fiancé's arm again, but Preston held his hands up, stepping further backward into the crowd of relatives. "Do not touch me," Preston said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "My family's reputation relies on absolute transparency. If you have been living off embezzled money, my board will have my head. I am done with this. I am completely done." Preston turned on his heel and marched straight off the terrace, heading directly for the front gates of the estate. Rachel let out a guttural scream of pure panic. "Preston, wait. Preston!" She hiked up the skirt of her expensive designer dress and ran after him, her high heels clicking frantically against the stone. But he did not even slow down. The pretty one, the sister who had built her entire identity on securing a wealthy man, was left sobbing hysterically in the middle of the driveway, abandoned and exposed. I stood perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. They had spent my entire life building pedestals out of cruelty and vanity. All I had done was kick the support beams out from under them. I turned my gaze back to the head of the table. Cameron had collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of the uncles and aunts who had idolized him for decades. The brilliant facade was entirely gone, leaving nothing but a desperate criminal waiting for the federal indictments to drop. My mother Barbara was clutching the edge of the dining table, hyperventilating. Her chest heaved as she stared at the ruined remains of her perfect family. The golden children had been reduced to ash in under 10 minutes. But the operation was still not complete. I had saved the most devastating piece of data for the people who truly deserved it. I reached into the manila envelope one last time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This one was not highlighted. It was a stark, simple legal contract bearing the signature of two very specific people. I looked at my father, who was staring into the distance, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world end. He thought the worst was over. He thought the embezzlement and the ruined wedding were the bottom of the barrel. He was profoundly mistaken. I held that single sheet of paper in my hand, but the explosion around the table demanded immediate attention. Before I could even present this final piece of evidence, the fragile dam holding my family together completely shattered. The illusion of the perfect Anderson family evaporated in real time, replaced by the vicious, ugly truth of who they really were. Richard suddenly slammed his hands down on the linen tablecloth. The expensive crystal wine glasses rattled and tipped over, spilling dark red liquid that seeped into the white fabric like blood. He did not look at me. He turned his entire body toward Cameron. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You stole from our clients!" Richard roared. His booming voice was no longer jovial. It was a weapon. "You embezzled from trust accounts. Do you have any idea what you have done? You have completely destroyed the Anderson name." Cameron flinched, backing his chair up so violently it scraped against the stone patio. But the fear in his eyes quickly morphed into cornered, desperate anger. The golden child, who had never been held accountable for a single mistake in his entire 36 years of life, was suddenly facing total annihilation, and he refused to go down alone. "Do not you dare act like you are innocent in this!" Cameron screamed back, throwing his hands up. "You pushed me into this. You forced me into wealth management. You sat at the country club boasting about my returns and demanding double-digit growth every single quarter. When the market shifted, you told me to figure it out or step down. You told me winners never show weakness." "I told you to work harder," Richard bellowed, taking a threatening step toward his son. "I did not tell you to become a common thief. You lost millions of dollars gambling. You threw away our entire reputation on a poker table." "I was trying to cover the margins," Cameron yelled, his voice cracking hysterically. "I needed quick liquidity. If I had admitted the firm was losing money, you would have cut me off just like you cut Lydia off. I saw what you did to her. I knew exactly what happens to the children who disappoint you. I was not going to be the family failure." The admission hung in the ocean air. Cameron had just confessed that the driving force behind his massive federal crimes was the absolute terror of failing our father. The toxic perfectionism Richard had cultivated had directly bred a desperate criminal. Before Richard could respond, a sharp, agonizing wail cut through the courtyard. Rachel had returned. She stumbled back onto the terrace looking like a discarded porcelain doll. Her custom designer gown was stained with dirt at the hem. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess from the wind, and her heavy eye makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She marched directly toward Cameron, her hands curled into fists. "He is gone," she shrieked, her voice raw and jagged. Preston got into his town car and drove away. He called his lawyers from the driveway. "The wedding is canceled. The engagement is over. You ruined my life, Cameron." Rachel launched herself at our brother, pounding her fists against his chest. Cameron shoved her backward roughly, nearly knocking her off her feet. The polite rules of high society had completely vanished. They were acting like feral animals. "I ruined your life!" Cameron spat out, his face contorted in disgust. "I funded your life. I paid for your ridiculous vanity. You demanded $50,000 shopping sprees to impress Preston's mother. You cried to me that you could not be seen wearing the same designer dress twice. You sucked me dry, Rachel. You are a parasite. You told me it was trust fund money." Rachel screamed back, tears flying from her face. "You told me you were making millions. You lied to me. Rachel turned her venomous gaze toward our father. "And you," she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Richard. "You are the one who told me I had to secure a wealthy husband. You told me my only job was to look beautiful and marry into old money. You pushed me to keep up with Preston's family. You told me to spend whatever it takes. This is your fault. Do not you dare blame me for your brother's criminal behavior." Richard shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "I provided everything for this family. Everything." The screaming escalated into a deafening, chaotic roar. The three of them stood in the center of the terrace, tearing each other apart. They hurled insults, dragged up old resentments, and viciously attacked each other's deepest insecurities. The polished, sophisticated family that had spent decades looking down on the rest of the world was currently engaged in a vicious street brawl. I watched the golden children, the ones who were supposed to be better and smarter and more deserving than me, completely destroy one another. Barbara had been standing frozen near the head of the table, clutching her pearl necklace and hyperventilating. She watched her perfect husband, her genius son, and her beautiful daughter publicly implode. The reality of her failed parenting was playing out in front of 50 extended relatives. She could not handle the destruction of her carefully curated narrative. She desperately needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame for the fire consuming her house. She turned to me. Her eyes were wild, completely unhinged. "You did this!" Barbara shrieked. She lunged toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You came here to destroy us. You planned this entire night just to tear this family apart. You are a monster, Lydia." I did not step back. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her with profound, empty pity. "I did not force Cameron to steal Mother," I replied, my voice projecting a calm, steady authority over the chaos. "I did not force Rachel to live off embezzled funds. I did not force Dad to value status over integrity. I did not light the match. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the rats." Barbara let out a frustrated, agonizing scream. She raised her hand as if she wanted to strike me, but Diana stepped smoothly to my side, a silent physical warning that any physical contact would result in immediate police intervention. Barbara dropped her hand, sobbing uncontrollably into her palms. I walked slowly back to my chair at the head of the table. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my bespoke suit. I reached out and picked up my crystal wine glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive vintage. I simply sat back and watched the fire burn. The toxic dynamic I had suffered under for 33 years was eating itself alive right in front of me. Cameron was now weeping openly on the stone tiles, begging Richard to help him secure a defense attorney. Richard was shouting that he would not spend a single dime of his own money to keep a thief out of prison. Rachel was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth, crying about her ruined reputation and the social exile she was about to face in Manhattan. The extended family looked on in absolute paralyzed horror. These were the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had spent decades enabling my parents. They had happily attended the lavish parties, eaten the expensive food, and turned a blind eye whenever my parents humiliated me. They had participated in the collective delusion that the Andersons were modern royalty. Now they were seeing the rot underneath the gold plating. Aunt Pamela, the woman who had called me an ugly duckling just hours earlier, was backed against a decorative stone pillar. She was physically trembling, holding her purse tightly against her chest. She looked at me, sitting calmly at the head of the table, sipping my wine, and she quickly averted her eyes, terrified that I might turn my attention toward her next. Uncle Thomas gently took his wife's arm and began moving quietly toward the exit. Several other cousins followed suit. They were abandoning the sinking ship, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of federal crimes and embezzled funds. The social elite do not stand by you when the FBI is looming. They scatter. My mother sank into a chair, burying her face in her arms, weeping loudly. "My family," she moaned over and over. "My beautiful, perfect family. It is all ruined. Everything is ruined." She still could not see the truth. She was mourning the loss of the illusion, not the reality. She did not care that her son was a criminal or that her daughter was an accomplice. She only cared that the country club would find out. She only cared that she could no longer hold her head high at charity galas. I sat in the seat of honor surrounded by the shattered remains of their pride. I felt no guilt. I felt no remorse. I had spent my entire life starving for their affection while they feasted on my self-esteem. They had demanded my compliance and expected my silence. But silence is a funny thing. When you force someone to be quiet for decades, they use that time to listen. They use that time to watch. They use that time to gather every single piece of data required to dismantle the people keeping them in the dark. I placed my wine glass back on the table. The sharp clink of the crystal drew the attention of my father. Richard stopped shouting at Cameron and looked at me. His chest heaved and his face was covered in a cold sweat. He looked utterly defeated. He thought the punishment was over. He thought the absolute worst had already happened. The embezzlement had been exposed. The golden boy was going to prison. The perfect daughter was socially annihilated. The extended family was fleeing the estate in droves. What more could possibly be taken from them? He did not know about the single sheet of paper still resting under my left hand. He did not know that the true depths of his own depravity had yet to be brought into the light. I looked at Richard and let a cold, sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. The golden children had been completely destroyed by their own greed, but the architects of this toxic empire still had to answer for their own sins. It was time to deal with the parents. I slid the final sheet of paper out from under my hand. The stark white document seemed to glow against the dark wood of the table. Richard was breathing heavily. He was trying to compose himself, attempting to pull the shreds of his dignity back together. He wiped a hand across his sweating forehead and looked at me with a pathetic attempt at a paternal plea. "Lydia," he said, his voice shaking but trying to sound reasonable, "you have made your point. Your brother is a disgrace. We had no idea he was doing this. Your mother and I are victims in this too. We trusted him. We gave him everything and he destroyed us. Please put the papers away. Let us handle this as a family before the authorities get involved. We need to do damage control." I did not hand him the paper. I did not even look at him. I looked at Diana, who was standing a few feet away. Diana gave a sharp nod, her expression hardening into absolute legal severity. She stepped forward, taking her place right beside my chair at the head of the table. "You are not a victim, Richard," Diana stated clearly, her voice cutting through the salty ocean air. "And you certainly did not find out about Cameron's embezzlement today." Richard froze. Barbara stopped crying and looked up, her eyes darting between me and the attorney. "What are you talking about?" Barbara asked, her voice cracking. "We just found out. You just told us." I shook my head slowly. I tapped the single sheet of paper with my index finger. "You see, Mom, I have spent the last decade building digital security networks. My firm tracks data trails for a living. When we audited Vanguard Holdings, we did not just find Cameron's offshore transfers. We found the internal communications. We found the encrypted emails sent from your personal home network to Cameron's private server." I picked up the document. "6 months ago, Dad, you noticed a massive discrepancy in the firm's quarterly tax filings. You confronted Cameron. You demanded to know where the money went. And Cameron, terrified of your wrath, confessed everything. He told you about the gambling. He told you about the missing millions. He told you that federal regulators were scheduled for a routine audit by the end of the year, and that if the money was not replaced, he would go to federal prison." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The remaining relatives, the ones who had not yet fled the terrace, gasped in shock. "You knew," I said, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes. "You both knew your golden boy was a federal criminal 6 months ago. But instead of turning him in, instead of holding him accountable, you decided to cover it up. You decided to play the loving, protective parents. But here is the fascinating part. You did not want to sell this beautiful coastal estate to cover his debts. You did not want to liquidate your own retirement accounts. You did not want to sacrifice your country club lifestyle, your luxury cars, or your precious social standing." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You needed millions of dollars in liquid cash to quietly replace the stolen trust funds, but you refused to pay for it yourselves. So you looked around for a sacrificial lamb. You looked for someone expendable." Barbara let out a high-pitched whining sound, clutching her chest. "Lydia, please do not do this. We were desperate. We were trying to save our son. You were trying to save your ego, I corrected her sharply. And your solution was to destroy me. Diana stepped forward again, pointing to the document in my hand. 33 years ago, when Lydia was born, her paternal grandfather established a small land trust in her name. It was a modest commercial property in downtown Boston. Over the decades, the property value skyrocketed. It is completely unencumbered and owned outright under Lydia's legal name and social security number. I held up the document so Richard could see his own forged signature on the bottom line. 2 weeks ago, Dad, you approached a private lending firm. You used your status as the original executor of that childhood trust, a status that legally expired when I turned 18, by the way, to quietly apply for a massive second mortgage against my property. You attempted to take out a $4 million loan using my pristine credit score, my social security number, and my property as collateral. The absolute silence on the terrace was deafening. Even Cameron, who was still sitting with his head in his hands, looked up in shock. He knew his parents were trying to get the money, but he apparently did not know exactly who they were planning to steal it from. You forged my signature, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You and Mom conspired to saddle me with $4 million of high-interest debt. You were going to quietly funnel that money into Vanguard Holdings to hide Cameron's embezzlement. You were perfectly willing to completely destroy my credit, bankrupt me, and attach my name to a fraudulent loan just to keep your golden boy out of jail. Richard's face was completely ashen. He was shaking his head back and forth mechanically. I was going to pay it back, he stammered. I was going to make the monthly payments myself. I just needed your credit profile because the banks would not lend to me with my current debt ratio. I was not going to let you default Lydia. I swear I was going to handle it. You committed identity theft and bank fraud, I stated coldly, ignoring his pathetic excuses. You attempted to financially ruin the daughter you spent decades calling a failure so you could save the son who is actually a criminal. You decided that my life, my future, and my security were completely expendable as long as it kept the Anderson name out of the tabloids. Barbara threw herself forward, grabbing the edge of the table. She was weeping hysterically, her makeup completely ruined. We did not have a choice, she wailed. Cameron was going to go to prison. He is your brother, Lydia. You have so much money now. You do not even need that credit score. You do not need that property. You could have helped us. You should have helped us. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at the incredible depths of her delusion. She had just been caught trying to commit federal fraud against her own daughter, and her immediate response was to blame me for not offering myself up as a willing victim. I do not owe you my destruction, Mother, I replied, my voice unwavering. And I certainly do not owe you my financial security to cover up your criminal conspiracy. The few remaining extended family members began backing away toward the exits. They had stayed for the drama, but identity theft and bank fraud were crossing a line that none of them wanted to be associated with. Uncle Thomas literally turned his back on my father, shaking his head in absolute disgust as he guided his wife off the terrace. They were leaving the Andersons behind permanently. Richard tried to stand up tall, trying to summon the imposing patriarchal authority that had ruled our family for decades. He puffed out his chest, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably. Listen to me, Lydia, he commanded, his voice rough and uneven. We are your family. We made a desperate decision in a desperate time. But you stopped the loan. No harm was done. The transaction did not go through. We can keep this quiet. We can settle this internally without getting the authorities involved. You have made your point. You are the successful one. Now act like an adult and help us fix this. He was still giving orders. Even backed into a corner covered in the evidence of his own crimes, he still believed he had the right to tell me what to do. He still believed he was the untouchable king of the castle. No harm was done, I repeated, echoing his words. You tried to throw me in front of a moving train, Dad. The only reason I am not standing here with $4 million of fraudulent debt attached to my name is because my cybersecurity firm flagged the unauthorized credit inquiry and blocked the transaction before the funds were dispersed. You did not show mercy. You got caught. Diana pulled a sleek black folder from her briefcase and laid it gently on the table next to the evidence. As your legal counsel, Richard, I strongly suggest you stop speaking, Diana advised him smoothly. Every word you say is currently being documented. The fraudulent loan application containing your forged signatures has already been handed over to the federal authorities along with the evidence of Cameron's embezzlement. Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. You reported us! He gasped, clutching his chest. You turned your own parents over to the feds. I did not turn you over, Dad, I corrected him. You handed yourselves over the moment you decided to commit bank fraud. I simply refused to be your accomplice. Barbara let out a long, agonizing scream. She dropped to her knees on the stone patio, clutching her face. My life is over, she sobbed into the dirt. My friends, my house, my reputation, everything is gone. She was still mourning her reputation. She was facing federal prison for identity theft and conspiracy, and all she could think about was what the women at the country club would say. It was a perfect crystalline representation of the exact sickness that had infected our family since I was born. Rachel, who had been standing frozen near the edge of the patio, suddenly rushed forward. She pointed a shaking finger at our parents. You tried to steal from her! Rachel shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. You committed fraud to save Cameron, but you did not tell Preston's family anything. You let me plan a wedding with stolen money. You are all going to jail, and you dragged me down with you. Rachel turned to me, her eyes wide and desperate. Lydia, she begged, clasping her hands together. Lydia, please, you have to tell the authorities I had nothing to do with the mortgage. You have to tell them I did not know about the embezzlement. You have to save me. Lydia, please. I looked at my sister. The pretty one. The one who had spent the entire afternoon mocking my appearance and calling me a lonely spinster. Now she was begging the ugly duckling for salvation. I am not saving anyone tonight, Rachel, I said, my voice as cold as ice. You all made your choices. You chose to live beyond your means. You chose to value status over integrity. You chose to treat me like garbage because you thought I was powerless to stop you. I reached out and picked up my crystal wine glass, taking one final sip before setting it down gently on the ruined table. The golden children and the perfect parents had been utterly annihilated by their own arrogance. The truth had burned their false empire to the ground. But the execution was not over yet. They thought the federal authorities were the biggest threat to their existence. They thought the impending legal charges were the final blow. They were wrong. The trap I had built for them had one final steel jaw left to snap shut. Richard stared at the single sheet of paper containing his forged signature. The reality of his federal crime sat heavily on the ruined dining table between us, but the human ego is a terrifying mechanism. Instead of dropping to his knees and begging for mercy, Richard decided to double down. I watched the transformation happen in real time. The panic that had completely drained the color from his face was suddenly replaced by a dark, venomous rage. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life crushing his opponents under the weight of his expensive legal team and his prestigious country club connections. He simply could not compute the fact that his own daughter, the one he deemed completely worthless, had outmaneuvered him. Richard straightened his posture. He reached up and adjusted his silk tie with shaking hands, forcing his broad shoulders back. He looked at Diana, then shifted his furious, blazing gaze back to me. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered visibly under his skin. You think you have won? Richard growled. His voice was low, dropping into the dangerous gravelly register he reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. You think buying this estate and throwing a few printed spreadsheets on a table makes you untouchable? You are completely delusional, Lydia. You have absolutely no idea what kind of war you have just started. I remained totally silent, letting him dig his grave deeper. I wanted him to exhaust his entire arsenal of empty threats. I have the best defense attorneys in the state on retainer, Richard spat, pointing a rigid, trembling finger directly at my face. I have lawyers who eat arrogant little tech startups for breakfast. You think you can hand over a few emails to the federal authorities and walk away clean? I will bury you in litigation. I will tie up this ridiculous real estate acquisition in civil court for the next 2 decades. I will file immediate injunctions on your business operations. I will claim you obtained those audit documents through illegal corporate espionage, and I will have your precious cybersecurity firm dismantled by federal regulators before the next fiscal quarter even begins. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward me, his expensive leather shoes grinding into the spilled wine and broken glass on the travertine tiles. You bought this property with cash. Richard sneered, his confidence artificially inflating with every threat he hurled into the night air. That means your liquidity is heavily tied up in a physical asset. When my legal team files a massive defamation and tortious interference lawsuit against you tomorrow morning, all of your company assets will be frozen pending a massive federal investigation. You will not be able to make payroll. Your clients will flee the moment the subpoenas become public record. I will drag you through years of depositions until you are completely bankrupt. You will be begging to sell this estate back to me for pennies on the dollar just to pay your mounting legal fees. Hearing his father launch a vicious counterattack seemed to act like a defibrillator on Cameron. The golden boy, who had been weeping into his hands just moments ago, suddenly lifted his head. The threat of total destruction had terrified him, but the promise of legal vengeance breathed temporary toxic life back into his pathetic lungs. Cameron stood up violently, wiping the tears and snot from his face with the sleeve of his custom-tailored suit. He looked at me with a twisted, ugly expression of pure hatred. The absolute sheer arrogance of the Anderson men was staggering to witness. Even facing federal prison for embezzlement, Cameron still believed he was inherently superior to me. Dad is absolutely right, Cameron snapped, his voice regaining some of its usual grating condescension. You have no idea how the real corporate world works, Lydia. You sit behind a computer screen in a dark room playing with data, and you think that makes you a titan of industry. You are completely out of your depth. Cameron stepped up beside our father, puffing out his chest to present a united front against me. It was the same physical intimidation tactic they had used on me since I was a teenager. You thought you could stroll in here and destroy us with a dramatic presentation. Cameron mocked, a cruel smile stretching across his tear-stained face. But you are just a hacker who got lucky. You do not understand high-level corporate law. You do not understand wealth management or asset protection. We have federal judges in our contact list. We have politicians who play golf with us every single weekend. You think a judge is going to side with a rogue tech worker over a senior partner at Vanguard Holdings and an established real estate mogul? Cameron let out a short barking laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. You are nothing, Lydia. You have always been nothing. You are just an ugly nerd who spent her entire life furious that she could not sit at the popular table. You think buying a nice suit and stealing a piece of real estate changes who you are. It does not change a single thing. You are still the pathetic, ugly duckling everyone pities. When our lawyers are done with you, you will lose everything. You will be back in a freezing studio apartment fixing routers for minimum wage, and nobody will even remember your name. Rachel, hearing the men in her family fighting back, found a scrap of her own misplaced courage. She stepped out from the shadows, wiping her ruined mascara and clutching her ruined dress. We will sue you for emotional distress, Rachel added, her voice shrill and grating. You ruined my engagement party on purpose. You humiliated me in front of Preston. My lawyers will take whatever is left of your miserable little company after Dad and Cameron are done with you. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly motionless. I did not cross my arms. I did not display a single ounce of defensive body language. I simply let the cool ocean breeze blow past me while I absorbed their desperate, venomous threats. This was exactly how they operated. When confronted with their own monstrous behavior, their immediate instinct was not accountability or remorse. Their immediate instinct was to launch a campaign of total destruction against the person holding the mirror. They honestly believed their social status and their expensive attorneys made them invincible. They believed the laws of the universe did not apply to the Anderson family. They were trying to bully me into submission using the exact same playbook they had used to control my mother, the extended family, and their corporate rivals. I looked at Richard, his chest heaving with false bravado. I looked at Cameron trying to mask his terror with arrogant cruelty. I looked at Rachel desperately clinging to the illusion of her superiority. "You are done speaking now," I stated. My voice was quiet, but it possessed a weight that immediately crushed the remaining air out of the courtyard. Richard opened his mouth to shout another legal threat, but the words died in his throat when he saw my eyes. I was not looking at him with anger. I was looking at him the same way a scientist looks at a specimen under a microscope. "You talk about high-powered lawyers, Dad," I said, measuring every word with lethal precision. "You talk about filing injunctions and freezing my assets. You talk about tortious interference and defamation. You throw these legal terms around like they are magic spells that will instantly vaporize your problems. But you are forgetting one critical fundamental detail about the transaction that took place today." I turned my gaze to Cameron, who immediately shrank back slightly under the weight of my stare. "You called me an ugly nerd who does not understand corporate law." I continued, my tone dropping into a deadly whisper. "You think I am a naive hacker who stumbled into a real estate deal without understanding the mechanics of wealth management. You think I exposed your massive federal crimes without having an absolute ironclad contingency plan already in place to counter your retaliation." I took a slow, deliberate step away from the dining table, moving closer to where Diana stood waiting. "You think you can tie up my real estate acquisition in civil court for 2 decades, I said, addressing my father once more. "You think you can sue me and bankrupt Aegis Data Defense? You think your country club lawyers are going to save you from the consequences of forging my signature on a $4 million mortgage application?" I shook my head slowly, letting a cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. "You are thinking far too small, Dad," I told him. "You are looking at the chessboard, but you do not even realize the game has already ended." Richard frowned, his false confidence wavering as he tried to decipher my meaning. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its aggressive edge. "I know exactly what you did today, Lydia. You bought the property deed. It is a simple commercial transaction. It can be contested in court tomorrow morning." "I did not buy the property deed, Dad," I corrected him softly. I stepped aside and gestured toward my attorney. Diana adjusted her designer glasses and stepped forward. She held a fresh stack of legally certified documents in her hands. The golden children and their arrogant father stood frozen, waiting for the final blow. They had threatened me with their lawyers. They had threatened me with total financial ruin. They had insulted my appearance, my intelligence, and my future. They had emptied their entire arsenal of abuse in a desperate bid to reassert their dominance. Now it was time to show them exactly what true corporate power looked like. Diana placed the thick stack of documents directly on top of the ruined tablecloth. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her absolute calm was far more terrifying than Richard's screaming. She looked at my father with the mild irritation of a teacher dealing with an unruly toddler. "You mentioned tying this acquisition up in civil court for 2 decades. Richard." Diana began sliding the first heavily notarized document across the table. "You threatened to file injunctions against Aegis Data Defense. You threatened to bankrupt Lydia with legal fees. That is a fascinating strategy. Unfortunately for you, it requires a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually transpired this morning." Richard glared at this paper but refused to touch it. "I know exactly what happened," he growled. "She bought the deed to this estate. It is a single asset transfer." "Wrong," Diana stated flatly. "Aegis Data Defense did not buy a single deed. When your son Cameron defaulted on his margin calls, he used his firm's remaining leverage to secure a predatory bridge loan from a parent holding company. Furthermore, Richard, to avoid paying property taxes, you transferred the deed of your primary residence, the sprawling mansion you and Barbara currently live in, into that exact same corporate holding structure 5 years ago. You thought you were being clever, hiding your personal wealth inside corporate shells." I watched the realization slowly begin to dawn in my father's eyes. The belligerent anger was starting to crack, revealing the sheer panic underneath. Lydia did not buy a single deed. Diana continued tapping the document with a manicured finger. She bought the entire holding company. She bought the parent organization that holds the lease to Vanguard Holdings corporate offices. She bought the corporate trust that holds the deed to your primary residence. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Lydia is the absolute sole owner of the building your son works in and the house you sleep in. Barbara let out a high-pitched gasp. She grabbed Richard's arm, shaking it frantically. Richard, what is she saying? What does that mean? It means, Mother, I interjected, leaning forward to rest my hands on the table, that I am your landlord. And Cameron's landlord. I own the roof over your heads and I own the floor beneath your desks. Cameron stumbled backward, gripping the stone railing of the terrace. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. You cannot do that, he choked out. That is a monopoly. That is illegal. It is standard corporate acquisition. Diana corrected him smoothly. But let us talk about what is actually illegal. Let us talk about why you will not be hiring any high-powered defense attorneys to fight this. Diana pulled the second document from the stack. It featured a bright blue federal court seal at the top. She pushed it toward my father. This time, Richard could not help himself. His trembling hands reached out and pulled the document closer. His eyes scanned the heavy legal text, and his face turned the color of wet ash. When you and Barbara attempted to forge Lydia's signature on a $4 million mortgage application, you crossed a very specific legal line. Diana explained, her voice ringing like a judge reading a final sentence. You transmitted fraudulent financial documents across state lines using a digital banking network. You attempted to leverage a childhood trust using stolen identifying information. That elevated your desperate little scheme from simple state-level fraud to a massive federal crime. Richard's breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked up at Diana, his eyes wide with absolute terror. You filed it, he whispered. You actually filed it with the federal authorities. I did not just file a report, Richard, Diana said, taking a step back to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Because I provided the federal authorities with irrefutable digital proof of your attempted bank fraud, along with the complete unredacted data logs proving Cameron's multi-million-dollar embezzlement. The federal judge did not hesitate. We requested an emergency injunction to prevent the flight of stolen capital. The judge granted it immediately. Diana looked around the terrified faces of the Golden family. As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, she announced clearly, every single bank account associated with Richard Anderson, Barbara Anderson, Cameron Anderson and Vanguard Holdings has been completely frozen. Rachel let out a sharp, agonizing scream. She dropped to her knees on the stone patio, clutching her ruined designer dress. Frozen, she shrieked. What do you mean, frozen? My accounts, too. Any account that received embezzled funds? Diana confirmed, looking down at my sister without an ounce of pity. Since Cameron wired over $1 million of stolen client money into your personal checking accounts to fund your lifestyle, your assets are now officially classified as the proceeds of a federal crime. Your credit cards, your checking accounts, your savings. Everything is locked pending a comprehensive federal investigation. Barbara began hyperventilating. She pulled her expensive smartphone from her clutch purse, her hands shaking so violently she dropped it twice. When she finally managed to unlock the screen, she frantically opened her banking app. We all watched in total silence as the red error messages popped up on her screen. Access denied. Account suspended. Please contact your financial institution. No, Barbara sobbed hysterically, tapping the screen over and over again. No, no, no. Richard, do something. Call the bank. Call someone. He cannot call anyone, Barbara. I stated, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of sympathy. Who is he going to call? His golf buddies, the country club president. Do you think those men are going to risk a federal indictment for associating with criminals? Do you think your high society friends are going to loan you money when they find out you tried to steal $4 million from your own daughter to cover up an embezzlement scheme? Richard looked like a broken man. The powerful, imposing patriarch had been entirely stripped of his armor. His broad shoulders caved in, and he slumped heavily against the dining table. The man who had spent 33 years telling me I was a worthless failure was now a penniless criminal staring down the barrel of federal prison. My lawyers, Richard mumbled, his voice barely a breath. I have them on retainer. Your retainer agreements have void clauses for federal asset freezes. Diana corrected him, delivering the final crushing blow to his legal defense strategy. I spoke with the senior partner of your preferred defense firm an hour ago. The moment they were notified that your assets were frozen under a federal fraud injunction, they dropped you as a client. They are not going to work for free, Richard. And you literally do not have a single dollar to your name. Cameron let out a bizarre broken laugh. It was the sound of a man's sanity snapping in half. The golden boy who had just sneered at me, calling me an ugly nerd who did not understand the real world, was now utterly destitute. He looked at his hands, then looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. "You planned this," Cameron whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and awe. "You did not just expose us. You trapped us. You locked the doors and set the building on fire." "I did not set the fire, Cameron," I reminded him, maintaining absolute steady eye contact. "You lit the match the day you stole your first client's retirement fund to pay for a poker game. Mom and Dad poured gasoline on the flames the day they tried to steal my identity to save you. I just made sure you could not buy your way out of the burning building." The reality of their situation crashed down on them with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. They were completely trapped. They had no money. They had no lawyers. They had no social standing. The extended family had abandoned them. Rachel's wealthy fiancé had fled in disgust. Their entire empire, built on a foundation of lies, cruelty, and stolen money, had been meticulously dismantled and vaporized in the span of a single afternoon. Barbara was rocking back and forth on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Rachel was staring blankly at the ocean, her perfect life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Cameron was hyperventilating, clutching his chest as the panic attack fully consumed him. Richard just stared at the legal injunction on the table, the document that officially ended the Anderson family legacy. They had spent my entire life trying to break me. They had called me the ugly one, the practice child, the disappointment. They had pushed me into the shadows and demanded my silence so they could shine brighter. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the shadows. The shadows are where you learn to see everything without being seen. The shadows are where you build your strength. I looked at my family, the broken, ruined remnants of the people who had tortured me for 3 decades. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No anger, no sadness, no pity. The emotional tether that had tied me to their approval had been completely severed. "Diana," I said, turning to my attorney, my voice ringing clear and strong over the sound of their weeping, "I believe we have one final piece of administrative business to conclude before we leave my property." Diana nodded smoothly, reaching into her briefcase one last time. She pulled out a pristine folder containing 3 legally certified documents, the final nails in the coffin. I turned back to my father, my mother, and my brother. The time for revelations and evidence was over. Now it was time for the execution. I held out my hand and Diana placed the 3 pristine documents directly into my palm. The paper felt heavy, crisp, and devastatingly final. I walked slowly down the length of the ruined dining table. The expensive china was pushed aside. The crystal glasses lay shattered. The elegant floral centerpieces were crushed under the weight of the federal injunctions already scattered across the linen. I stopped in front of Cameron first. He was no longer looking at me. His eyes were fixed blindly on the stone patio, his chest rising and falling in sharp, erratic jerks. I dropped the first document right into his lap. He flinched violently, as if the paper itself burned him, but he did not make a move to pick it up. "That is a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to vacate commercial premises," I told him. My voice was steady, carrying absolute authority. "Since I now own the parent company that holds the lease to Vanguard Holdings, I am officially terminating that lease. Your firm has exactly 1 month to pack up your desks, your filing cabinets, and your fake success. You will clear out of that building completely, and since your corporate accounts are federally frozen, you will not be able to hire movers. I suggest you start finding some cardboard boxes, Cameron." Cameron let out a pathetic choking sound. He grabbed his hair with both hands, pulling at the carefully styled locks until they stood up in chaotic tufts. The corporate empire he had used to bludgeon me at every family holiday was officially dead, and I was the one locking the doors. I took a step to my left, stopping in front of my mother. Barbara was still on her knees, the fabric of her incredibly expensive designer dress soaking up the spilled wine from the travertine tiles. She looked up at me, her face completely unrecognizable. The meticulously maintained high society matriarch was gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate woman staring at the very daughter she had spent decades trying to erase. I dropped the second document right onto the flagstones directly in front of her trembling hands. "And this is your residential eviction notice, Mother," I stated coldly. "The holding company I acquired owns the deed to your primary residence. You transferred it into a corporate shell to dodge property taxes and shield it from personal liability. But that clever little tax loophole just made me your direct landlord. You and Dad have 30 days to vacate the premises." Diana stepped forward to clarify the legal parameters. Her voice was sharp and unforgiving. "Please be advised that any attempt to strip the property of its fixtures, appliances, or architectural assets will be met with immediate criminal charges for vandalism and theft," Diana informed my mother. "The property must be vacated in pristine condition. You may take your personal clothing and whatever small items you can carry. The rest belongs to the holding company." Barbara let out a sound that was less human and more like a wounded animal. She scrambled forward, grabbing the hem of my trousers. Her manicured fingernails dug into the fabric. "Lydia, please!" Barbara begged, her voice shattering into 1,000 hysterical pieces. "You cannot do this to us. It is our home. It is the family home. Where will we go? Our accounts are frozen. We do not have cash for a hotel. We do not have money for a security deposit on an apartment. We will be homeless, Lydia. You are throwing your own mother out onto the street." I looked down at her hands gripping my suit. I did not move away, but I did not offer a single ounce of comfort. "You threw me out onto the street 15 years ago, Mother," I reminded her, my tone absolutely stripped of any warmth. "When I dropped out of college because the anxiety and depression you fueled became too much to bear, you gave me 1 week to pack my bags. You offered zero financial support. You offered zero emotional support. You told me I was an embarrassment and you slammed the front door in my face. I slept on a mattress on the floor of an unheated studio apartment. I survived on instant noodles and tap water. I figured it out. You are a smart woman, Mother. I am sure you will figure it out too." I gently but firmly pulled my leg back, forcing her hands to slip off my suit. Barbara collapsed entirely, pressing her forehead against the cold stone, weeping with an intensity that shook her entire frame. Rachel, who was sitting nearby, suddenly realized the math of the situation. She looked from Barbara to me, her eyes wide with fresh mounting terror. "Wait!" Rachel gasped, scrambling to her feet. "If Mom and Dad are evicted, where am I supposed to go? Preston just canceled the wedding. I moved out of my Manhattan apartment last month because Mom said I could live at the estate until I got married. If you take the house, I do not have anywhere to live." I turned my head slowly to look at the pretty one, the sister who had spent the entire afternoon mocking my lack of a husband and calling me a lonely spinster. "That sounds like a massive logistical problem, Rachel." I agreed, my expression perfectly flat. "You spent the last 3 years living off stolen retirement funds. You funded your entire glamorous lifestyle with dirty money Cameron embezzled from his clients. Since all of those funds are now frozen pending a massive federal investigation, you are completely broke." Rachel rushed toward me, holding her hands out in a desperate, pleading gesture. "I can work for you, Lydia," Rachel cried, her voice shrill and panicked. "I can do public relations for your company. I can plan your corporate events. Just please do not leave me on the street. I do not know how to survive without money." I laughed, a short, dry sound that held no humor. "You do not have any marketable skills, Rachel. You just have incredibly expensive taste. I suggest you start checking the local classifieds for a roommate who does not mind living with an accessory to wire fraud." Rachel opened her mouth to scream at me, but the absolute finality in my eyes silenced her. She realized in that exact moment that her beauty, her charm, and her practiced tears held absolutely no currency here. The world she knew had evaporated, and she was entirely unequipped to survive in the real one. She backed away, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. Finally, I turned to my father. Richard had not moved from his chair. He was sitting with his shoulders hunched, staring at the destruction of his family. The booming patriarch who had orchestrated the fraudulent $4 million mortgage application against my name was completely broken. I placed the third and final eviction notice directly in front of him. This one was for the corporate suites that housed his own legacy business, the business he had used to buy his country club memberships and his luxury cars. Richard looked down at the paper, but he did not reach for it. He slowly raised his head to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot and his face looked 20 years older than it had when the sun came up this morning. "You really did it," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse and hollow. "You completely destroyed us. You burned the Anderson family to the ground." I stared at the man who had called me his practice child. I stared at the man who had laughed with his wealthy friends about my appearance and my perceived lack of ambition. I stared at the man who had tried to steal my identity and bankrupt me to save his criminal son. "I did not destroy this family, Dad," I said, measuring every single syllable with lethal precision. "You did. You built an empire entirely out of glass and vanity. You demanded absolute perfection, and you punished anyone who showed a single flaw. You created an environment so incredibly toxic that Cameron became a federal criminal just to avoid disappointing you. You taught Rachel that her only value was in her appearance and her ability to marry into money. You taught Mother that social status was the only metric of human worth." I took a step back, taking in the complete devastating ruin of the golden children and the perfect parents. For my entire life, I continued, my voice rising slightly, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute victory over the ocean breeze. "You all called me the ugly one. You called me the practice child. You told me I was a failure because I did not want to play your shallow, vicious games. You told me over and over again that I did not fit in with this family." I looked Richard dead in the eye. My gaze was steady, unbreakable, and burning with 33 years of quiet, calculated strength. "You were right about one thing, Dad," I told him, my tone dropping into a fierce, chilling certainty. "I do not fit in with this family. But it is not because I am ugly. It is not because I am a failure. I do not fit in with the Andersons because I do not steal. I do not lie, and I do not lose." Richard closed his eyes tightly, a single tear escaping and tracking through the deep lines on his weathered face. He had absolutely no response. There was no argument left to make. The truth was an executioner's block, and the blade had just dropped. I turned away from the dining table. I did not look at Cameron weeping into the stone patio. I did not look at Rachel shaking with terror about her impending homelessness. I did not look at Barbara begging the empty air for mercy. Diana stepped smoothly into stride beside me, matching my exact pace. She adjusted her briefcase, looking completely unbothered by the absolute devastation we were leaving in our wake. "The security teams will arrive tomorrow morning to officially serve the physical notices and secure the perimeter of the commercial properties," Diana informed me, her professional tone a sharp contrast to the sobbing behind us. "The federal authorities have confirmed the asset freeze is fully enacted across all international networks. Your instructions have been carried out to the exact letter, Lydia." "Excellent work, Diana," I replied, keeping my gaze focused straight ahead on the massive glass doors of my newly acquired estate. "Please ensure the property management firm begins vetting new tenants for the corporate suites immediately. I do not want those spaces sitting empty once the evictions are enforced." We walked together across the sprawling travertine terrace, moving away from the wreckage. The sun was beginning to set over the Pacific Ocean, casting long, brilliant streaks of gold and deep purple across the water. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of salt and freedom. For decades I had walked through the world making myself small to avoid their cruelty. I had accepted the role of the ugly duckling because it was the only space they allowed me to occupy. But the shadows had forged me into something made of steel and data and unrelenting willpower. I stepped through the grand glass doors of the coastal mansion, leaving the Anderson family behind in the dark. The house was quiet, spacious, and completely mine. The operation was over. The past was dead, and the future was entirely in my control. The morning after the reunion, the fallout was absolute and immediate. The Anderson family's social annihilation did not happen slowly. It happened with the brutal, terrifying speed of a modern digital collapse. By 9 o'clock the next morning, my father's cell phone, which had been ringing nonstop for decades, with calls from politicians, golf partners, and country club board members, went entirely dead. The silence in their house must have been deafening. The extended family, the aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had happily eaten the expensive catered food and laughed at my expense just hours earlier, evaporated like smoke. Uncle Thomas, the pediatrician, who had always prized his community reputation, was the first to officially sever ties. He sent a brief, legally worded email to Richard, stating that he and his wife Linda would no longer be associating with the primary branch of the Anderson family. He cited the federal fraud allegations and the deeply disturbing treatment of their niece as the sole reasons. He blind copied the entire extended family on the email. Aunt Pamela, the woman who had loudly called me an ugly duckling in front of my attorney, did not even have the courage to send an email. She simply blocked my parents' phone numbers and deleted every single photograph containing Richard Barbara Cameron or Rachel from her social media accounts. The rats were not just fleeing the sinking ship, they were actively denying they had ever been on board. The consequences for Cameron hit with the force of a freight train. Vanguard Holdings, recognizing the catastrophic legal exposure of having a senior partner under federal investigation for multi-million-dollar embezzlement, moved with ruthless corporate efficiency. They fired him before noon on Monday. They did not offer him a severance package. They did not allow him to resign quietly to save face. They terminated him with extreme prejudice and immediately filed their own civil lawsuit against him to recover the stolen client funds. Cameron, the golden boy who had spent his entire life looking down on the rest of the world, was suddenly radioactive. His former colleagues refused to take his calls. His expensive friends from the financial sector blocked his number. He was facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and he was entirely alone. Rachel's destruction was perhaps the most pathetic to witness because it required absolutely no effort on my part. The pretty one had built her entire identity on securing a wealthy husband. She believed her appearance and her charm made her invincible. She believed Preston's old money family would protect her. She was profoundly mistaken. Preston's family did not just cancel the wedding. They executed a targeted, calculated campaign of social erasure. They released a brief, icy statement to the society pages of the local papers, announcing that the engagement had been terminated due to irreconcilable differences regarding core family values. It was a polite, sanitized way of telling the entire Manhattan elite that Rachel Anderson was damaged goods and her family were common thieves. Rachel tried to call Preston for weeks, leaving desperate, hysterical voicemails begging for a second chance. She claimed she didn't know about the embezzled funds. She claimed she was a victim of Cameron's manipulation. Preston never answered. He changed his phone number, and within 2 months, he was photographed attending a charity gala with a new, highly suitable woman from an impeccable family. Rachel was replaced and forgotten before she even had time to pack up the designer clothes she had bought with stolen money. For my parents, Richard and Barbara, the descent into reality was agonizing. The federal asset freeze held firm. They could not access their retirement accounts. They could not tap into their investment portfolios. They were functionally bankrupt overnight. 30 days after the reunion, the eviction notices I had served them became legally enforceable. They had tried to fight it, of course. Richard had managed to find a bottom-tier defense attorney willing to work pro bono for the publicity, but the lawyer dropped the case after reviewing the ironclad documentation of their attempted mortgage fraud. They had absolutely no legal recourse. They had signed the deed transfer 5 years ago to dodge taxes, and now that clever little loophole had left them homeless. They were forced to vacate the sprawling mansion in Monterey. They had to leave behind the custom furniture, the expensive artwork, and the massive swimming pool. They were allowed to take only their personal clothing and a few small items, just as Diana had warned them. Barbara, the woman who had spent 33 years obsessing over status and appearances, was reduced to packing her designer dresses into cheap cardboard boxes. She wept continuously throughout the move, mourning the loss of her social standing more than the loss of her home. Richard, the booming patriarch who had tried to steal my identity to save his criminal son, was silent. He moved like a ghost, his broad shoulders permanently slumped. The arrogance that had fueled his entire life had been completely extinguished. They downsized to a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a rundown suburb of San Francisco. It was a neighborhood they would have actively avoided driving through just a month earlier. They had to sell Barbara's luxury SUV to a used car dealership just to afford the security deposit. Their country club memberships were permanently revoked. The board of directors cited the morals clause in their bylaws pointing to the impending federal fraud charges. Richard was escorted off the golf course by security when he tried to show up for his usual Sunday tea time. The humiliation was absolute and public. Cameron moved into the tiny apartment with them, unable to afford his own rent after his accounts were frozen. The golden boy and his perfect parents were now trapped in 1,000 square feet of cheap linoleum and thin walls, forced to look at each other every single day and remember exactly how they had destroyed their own empire. Rachel refused to live with them. She could not bear the reality of their new circumstances. She ended up crashing on the couch of a former college roommate who took pity on her. She was forced to take a minimum wage job as a receptionist at a mid-level public relations firm, a job she considered entirely beneath her, but desperately needed to survive. The woman who had demanded a $150,000 destination wedding was now answering phones and fetching coffee for people she would have previously ignored. The federal investigations ground on slowly but inevitably. The wheels of justice turned deliberately when dealing with multi-million-dollar wire fraud and identity theft. Cameron was formally indicted 6 months later. Richard and Barbara were named as co-conspirators in the mortgage fraud plot. They were drowning in legal fees, relying on court-appointed public defenders because their assets remained firmly locked by the federal injunction. The perfect Anderson family had been completely dismantled. They had spent my entire life building a fortress out of cruelty, vanity, and lies. They had believed their wealth and their status made them untouchable. They believed they could crush the ugly duckling without consequence. They learned the hard way that a fortress built on a rotten foundation will always collapse when the wind blows hard enough. And I had brought a hurricane. I did not gloat. I did not visit the tiny apartment to rub their faces in their failure. I did not need to. Their punishment was the life they were now forced to live, a life completely stripped of the wealth and status they valued above all else. I had simply removed the mask they presented to the world and allowed the natural consequences of their actions to consume them. I was finally free. The heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations and their constant criticism had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I no longer had to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of recognizing it. I was Lydia Anderson. I was the founder and CEO of Aegis Data Defense. I was brilliant. I was successful. And I was exactly where I belonged. 2 years later, the salty ocean breeze still carried the same crisp chill as it had on the day of that disastrous family reunion, but absolutely everything else about the Monterey coastal estate had completely transformed. The massive stone courtyard where my parents had once held court was no longer a stage for empty vanity and toxic social climbing. The grand sweeping staircase that Cameron had tried to use to intimidate me no longer led to private suites filled with hoarded wealth and stolen secrets. I had systematically gutted the entire property, stripping away the dark, heavy mahogany, the oppressive velvet drapery, and the ostentatious crystal chandeliers that my mother had prized so dearly. In their place, I installed floor-to-ceiling glass walls, sleek modern workstations, and state-of-the-art server rooms. The estate was now the official West Coast headquarters for the Aegis Data Defense Foundation. I walked slowly along the upper balcony, resting my hands on the smooth glass railing and looking down into what used to be the main formal dining hall. Today, that vast open space was filled with 70 young girls ranging from 12 to 18 years old. They were sitting at clustered high-tech desks, working collaboratively to solve complex cryptographic puzzles and writing their very first lines of advanced defense code. I had launched this nonprofit initiative exactly 1 year after the federal indictments against my father and brother were finalized. My mission was entirely clear and uncompromising. I wanted to find every single young girl who had ever been told she was too plain, too quiet, or too nerdy to matter, and I wanted to personally hand her the keys to the digital universe. I watched a group of 14-year-olds high-five each other after successfully compiling a complicated firewall program. They were brilliant, loud, and completely fearless. Nobody in this magnificent building was ever going to call them the practice child. Nobody was ever going to tell them that their only value in this world lay in securing a wealthy husband or maintaining a pristine social image. Here inside the empire I had built, intelligence was the ultimate currency, and relentless authenticity was the only standard that mattered. Just yesterday, a young student named Mia had come into my executive office crying because some boys at her middle school had relentlessly mocked her thick glasses and her intense interest in predictive algorithms. I had sat her down in the very same room where I had signed the eviction notices for my parents. I showed her the actual acquisition paperwork for the estate. I explained to her that the people who mock your appearance are almost always secretly terrified of your limitless potential. I told her that being underestimated by shallow people is the greatest tactical advantage you can ever possess in business and in life. When your enemies are busy laughing at your glasses, they never see your hands moving across the keyboard until it is far too late. Mia had wiped her eyes, squared her shoulders, and marched right back to her workstation. Today she was proudly leading her coding team to victory. The sound of confident, sharp footsteps echoed against the polished hardwood floor of the balcony, bringing my attention back to the present moment. Diana stepped up beside me, resting her arms on the sleek glass railing. She was wearing a sharp pearl gray suit that perfectly matched her formidable presence. She handed me a steaming cup of artisan coffee and looked out over the ocean with a deeply satisfied sigh. The federal sentencing guidelines were officially published this morning, Diana stated, her voice carrying its usual crisp, professional cadence. Your father and your brother both received the maximum allowable penalties for their respective charges of bank fraud and multi-million-dollar embezzlement. The federal judge was entirely unsympathetic to their pathetic pleas for leniency. Furthermore, the bankruptcy courts have successfully finalized the complete liquidation of their remaining trivial assets to pay the mandated legal restitution. It is completely finished, Lydia. They have absolutely nothing left. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark roast coffee, letting the comforting warmth spread through my chest. There was a time when hearing that news might have brought me a sense of vicious, vindictive joy. I might have celebrated their total destruction. But standing here now, surrounded by the incredible, vibrant empire I had built, I felt nothing but a profound, peaceful closure. The golden children and the perfect parents were a closed chapter in a book I no longer had any desire to read. Thank you, Diana, I said, turning to look at the remarkable woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me when the fire was burning its absolute hottest. I am thanking you not just for handling the massive legal fallout, but for believing in me when Aegis Data Defense was just a tiny, unknown startup operating out of a freezing studio apartment. Diana offered a rare, genuine smile that warmly crinkled the corners of her sharp eyes. I did not believe in you out of charity, Lydia, she replied smoothly. I believed in you because you presented me with an airtight business plan and a brilliant strategic mind. You earned every single piece of this massive success. You did the grueling hard work. I simply handled the paperwork. Diana turned to head back toward the executive suites, but paused thoughtfully, tapping her leather briefcase. Oh, and the board of directors unanimously approved your proposal to rapidly expand the scholarship program. We are officially opening the East Coast branch of the foundation next spring. The world is going to need a lot more girls exactly like you. As Diana walked away down the sunlit corridor, I felt a warm, heavy arm wrap gently around my waist. Evan stepped out onto the balcony, pulling me comfortably against his side. Evan was the lead architectural engineer who had overseen the massive structural renovation of the coastal estate. He was tall, incredibly kind, and possessed a deeply grounding energy that made me feel entirely safe. We had met during the initial chaotic planning phases of the headquarters design. Unlike the wealthy, shallow corporate men my sister Rachel had always desperately chased, Evan did not care about social climbing or country club prestige. He cared about structural integrity, honest hard work, and building beautiful things that lasted for generations. He kissed the top of my head and looked down at the sunlit courtyard where the students were taking their morning break. "You built an absolute masterpiece here," Lydia Evans said, his voice rumbling with deep, genuine pride. "Every time I look at this place, I'm completely amazed by what you envisioned and brought to life." I leaned into his warm embrace, resting my head against his strong shoulder. "You helped me build the walls, Evan," I reminded him softly. He chuckled a low, rich sound that vibrated against my side. "I just poured the concrete," he argued playfully. "You provided the indestructible foundation. You know, the lead instructor just told me that the enrollment applications for the next semester have completely tripled. You are going to need a much bigger estate very soon." I looked up into Evan's eyes. He looked down at me with absolute unfiltered adoration. He did not see the ugly duckling. He did not see the awkward, unloved practice child. He saw a titan of industry. He saw a woman who had taken the absolute worst cruelties the world had to offer and forged them into an unbreakable shield. Evan valued my brilliant analytical mind above everything else. When we sat together in the quiet evenings, we did not gossip about high society scandals or worry about superficial appearances. We talked about data architecture, sustainable building materials, and our shared ambitious vision for the future. He loved my mind, and in doing so, he had taught me to finally love my own reflection in the mirror. I turned my gaze back out toward the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The water was a brilliant deep sapphire stretching endlessly toward the bright horizon. The heavy waves crashed against the rugged stone cliffs below, sending massive plumes of white sea spray into the crisp morning air. The chaotic, vicious screaming of the family reunion felt like it had happened a lifetime ago in a completely different universe. I thought about my mother and father sitting in their cramped, poorly lit apartment, stripped of the massive wealth they had worshipped like a religion. I thought about Cameron sitting in a cold federal cell, his legendary arrogance finally silenced by solid steel bars. I thought about Rachel, fetching coffee and answering phones for junior executives she used to actively look down on. They had spent my entire childhood telling me I was the ugly one. They had tried desperately to convince me that I was a permanent stain on their perfect, immaculate canvas. But I had finally realized that true ugliness has absolutely nothing to do with the designer clothes you wear or the shape of your face. True ugliness is stealing millions from your own trusting clients. True ugliness is trying to ruin your own daughter's credit score to save your fragile ego. True ugliness is demanding absolute submission at the expense of a human soul. I took a deep cleansing breath of the fresh, salty air filling my lungs with absolute freedom. I was completely surrounded by my chosen family. I had a team of fiercely loyal colleagues who deeply respected my leadership. I had an attorney who protected my corporate empire with ruthless, terrifying efficiency. I had a loving, supportive partner who cherished my intellect and stood by my side as an absolute equal. And I had a massive building full of brilliant young girls who were learning exactly how to conquer the world on their own terms. I had taken the deep, agonizing trauma of being the family scapegoat, and I had weaponized it into something profoundly beautiful. I had built an untouchable fortress where the forgotten ones could learn to become completely invincible. The Anderson family was nothing but bitter ashes blowing away in the ocean wind. But Lydia Anderson was a towering, untouchable empire, and as I watched the morning sun rise higher over the sparkling ocean, I knew with absolute flawless certainty that this beautiful empire was going to stand forever. The greatest lesson I learned from 33 years of being called the ugly duckling is that the people who try the hardest to diminish your worth are almost always terrified of your potential. For decades, my family used cruelty and superficial metrics to keep me in the shadows. They believed that beauty was a currency, and that success was defined by country club memberships, designer labels, and the illusion of perfection. But true ugliness has nothing to do with your physical appearance or the clothes you wear. True ugliness is living a life built on lies, manipulation, and stepping on others to elevate yourself. When you are the family scapegoat, it is incredibly easy to internalize their toxic narrative and believe you are inherently flawed. But I am here to tell you that their inability to love you is a reflection of their own brokenness, not your value. You do not owe your loyalty, your financial security, or your sanity to people who only view you as an inconvenience or an asset to be exploited. The shadows they force you into can become the exact place where you forge your greatest strength. I used my time in the dark to listen, to learn, and to build an unbreakable foundation. When you finally stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you free yourself to create an empire of your own, one built on integrity, genuine connection, and absolute authenticity. You get to define what success looks like on your own terms. Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and build your own success? I want to hear your story. Share your experiences in the comments below. And if my journey to reclaiming my power resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about setting firm boundaries, surviving toxic families, and turning your deepest pain into your greatest triumph. Remember, your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it.